Chapter 135. The old noble families of Chongling had too many people to support, and they were used to spending. Once they declined and lost the pillar of support in the court, their decline was unimaginable. The Nie family of the past was the best example. The Nie family had once been the strongest family in Chongling under the Gongsun clan and had once held military power in the Qin dynasty. But when they lost their power and the strongest cultivator of the family, Nie Rang, died, the Nie family fell at an astounding speed. The families tried to sell their property. In just a few months, some of the Nie family's astounding antiques, and even items useful to cultivators, were sold, leaving only the enormous Nie garden. Even the Nie garden had been robbed. Every night, carriages would be stolen. In the end, the rare plants and trees were all stolen, and even some of the exquisite stone statues were dug up. Many of the stone and wood carvings that the great families of Chongling used as decorations came from the former Nie garden. The Zhou family of the old Chongling families had not completely disappeared like the Nie family of the past, but their situation was not good. The carriage carrying Ding Ning and the others stopped outside the Zhou family in garden. Ding Ning and the others got off the carriage and saw the bleak surroundings. Even many of the black tiles on the walls of Ink Garden were damaged, and weeds had grown out to reveal the mud below. Their gaze passed over the tall gray walls and into Ink Garden. Some of the pavilions deep in Ink Garden were mottled in color. Much of the paint had peeled off, and some of the cracked pillars had not been replaced. Xia Chongsheng was young, but he had heard countless times of the past glory and luxury of Chongling's old nobility. He knew that these old nobility had been more prominent than the present marquises, especially when he saw the layout of the pavilions that seemed to fit the great path and could not be compared to the homes of the present wealthy. He sighed sincerely. It seems that tens of thousands of gold is not enough to completely repair this place. Zhou Yunhai smiled slightly and said, "If you have the mind to give more, I will not refuse." This was clearly a joke, but Xia Chongsheng nodded and said with a smile, "If I can gain great benefits from the painting remnant scroll, maybe my sister and father will be happy and repair the entire Ink Garden. In that case, I hope that you will have the opportunity to understand more about cultivation," Zhou Yunhai said with a smile. But inside, he said disdainfully, "A country bumpkin like you, what can you see in a day?" The ancient trees in Ink Garden provided shade. Sunlight shone through the branches and leaves, forming spots of light of various sizes on the stone path below. It was quiet and artistic. When he truly entered Ink Garden and walked on this path, he finally understood why most of the pavilions had not been repaired for many years. This was because the walls, pillars, and eaves of most of the pavilions, terraces, and pavilions were inlaid with flowers and jade, pastel flowers and birds, and gold and silver decorations. Many of the paints were precious gemstone powder or the rare mica shell powder from overseas. Even now, the luxury surpassed the limits of what ordinary people could imagine. If ordinary decorations were used, they would not match. It was better to let them be old. People could feel the vicissitudes of time, and the past was grand. Just like the private gardens of all the old prestigious families in Chongling, Ink Garden took up a large area. After going around a small man-made mountain in the middle of the garden, the scenery in front of everyone changed. Everything seemed to turn completely black and white. Ink chrysanthemums, ink trees, white grass, all the strange grasses and trees in front of them were pure black and white, varying shades of black and white. Seeing this pure black and white, Shui Wangshu made a sound of surprise. Then he said calmly to Zhou Yunhai, "The painting remnant scroll of the Zhou family Ink Garden is not as good as seeing as hearing. In that case, I will stop here. On the way here, find a place to prepare a pot of hot tea for me." Zhou Yunhai said respectfully, "In that case, I will accompany Shui to the Cloud Sea Pavilion at the top of the mountain to rest. That is my study, and you can see most of Ink Garden." After saying this, he motioned for Zhou Xie to take Ding Ning and the others to continue forward. At the same time, he walked to Shui Wangshu's side. His body slowly released gentle primal energies of the universe to support Shui Wangshu. Sensing the pure primal energies of the universe coming off Zhou Yunhai's body, Xia Chongsheng's expression grew solemn. However, he did not understand and could not help but ask, he has not seen the painting remnant scroll yet. Why does Shui say it is not as good as seeing as hearing? Ding Ning glanced at him and did not say anything. He calmly took a few steps forward. Seeing his movements, Zhou Xiao's gaze flashed violently. In the end, there were hints of wariness and admiration in his eyes. Xia Chongsheng was not the only one. Zhang Yi, Nangong Kaishu, Xin Yi, and Su Heshan's eyes were wide to their limits. There was not even a hint of movement, not even a breeze. Yet Ding Ning's body had become absolute black and white. His clothes, hair, and skin, where the color had been dark, suddenly darkened and turned black. The areas that had been bright turned white. So the black and white here are not the true colors? Xie Chongsheng said dazedly. He finally reacted. The black and white here had been tainted by some kind of presence. It was like the power of the formation had caused the light and color to change. After taking a few quick steps, Zhou Xie passed Ding Ning, who had stopped. His body had become absolute black and white. He glanced at him and said coldly, "How do you know that black and white are not the original colors? How do you know that the colors you usually see are not illusions?" Ding Ning's brow imperceptibly furrowed. In reality, Zhou Xie's words were somewhat reasonable. However, Zhou Xie clearly could not understand them so deeply. He said these words to confuse Xie Chongsheng and confuse his thoughts. His gaze flashed. He wanted to say something but managed to stop himself. Nangong Kaishu and the others could not remain calm. Just now, Shui Wangshu's words meant that he seemed to have seen the painting remnant scroll directly. Was it the changes in energy here were all caused by the painting remnant scroll? It was just a fragment of a scroll, but it was like a large-scale array that could cause such a change. No wonder even the most powerful people wanted to borrow the painting remnant scroll to take a look. Zhou Xie continued to move forward. With each step, a puff of black and white smoke rose from the ground. He looked like he was walking in a painting. It was unreal. A trace of pride involuntarily appeared on his clearly defined face. Even though he had entered this place countless times to comprehend and was already familiar with every path to the point that he could walk through it with his eyes closed, every time he entered, he would still be amazed. Xie Chongsheng's eyes widened to their limits. Countless rivers and distant mountains appeared in front of him. The colors were appropriate, and they looked distant and vast. How could the Zhou family ink garden be so large? These were the first words that appeared in his mind. Yet when Zhou Xie, who was walking at the front, stopped, he suddenly realized. This was the painting remnant scroll. An ancient hall slowly appeared in the black and white light. The wooden ancient hall was dyed black like jade by the thick ink essence. There were no decorations inside the ancient hall. There was only a crystal wall on the stone floor at the center. This crystal wall was made up of two extremely thin pieces of crystal, and in the center of the wall was a broken scroll that was about 10 feet long and a few feet tall. He, Nangong Kaishu, and the others were shocked speechless again. Zhou Xie was surprised. His eyebrows unconsciously rose because Ding Ning's expression was still calm. This is the painting remnant scroll of the Zhou family. You can study it yourselves, but remember not to touch the crystal wall. Otherwise, the Jinji you activate is enough to kill any cultivator below Realm 5, he said slowly. Hearing this, Xie Chongsheng subconsciously took 2 steps forward. The first thing he wanted to do was to see the whole picture of the scroll and see what was drawn on it. Yet when his gaze swept across the remnant scroll, his breathing immediately became disordered. Countless mountains of varying depths, as well as rivers far and near, seemed to be pressing down on him in an instant. In an instant, he only felt dizzy. When he closed his eyes in great shock, he discovered that he actually had no impression of the entire picture scroll. He couldn't remember what was on the picture scroll at all. He couldn't even remember where the fragment of the picture scroll was. Why is it like this? Nangong Kaishu and the others felt the same. They could understand if they couldn't see any of the lines or the meaning behind any of the ink marks. But now that the scroll was right in front of them, they couldn't see the contents at all. They couldn't remember anything after seeing it, so they couldn't understand it. The group looked at each other. They saw Ding Ning looking in a daze calmly. Ding Ning could see the contents of the book. Could he see anything? Everyone had questions, but when they saw Ding Ning in a daze, they felt that they could not disturb him. They took a deep breath and focused again. Ding Ning looked calmly at the painting remnant scroll in front of him. This was a cultivation record that he knew of, but had never had a chance to see before. In the past, the Zhou family, in order to prevent some of the people they hated the most from entering the garden to view the scrolls, had even expressed their intention to destroy this remnant scroll. In the end, that group of people had made a concession in order to pass down the treasures of the cultivation world. In reality, both Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Sword Gate were the same to him. If they knew his identity, even if they had to destroy the sect, they would not let him see any of the secret manuals that were useful to him. There was a hint of emotion deep in his calm eyes. Innumerable Mo mountains and Mo rivers of varying depths instantly pressed down on him. However, he didn't even see these ink mountains and ink rivers. These ink mountains and ink rivers seemed to fly past his body and then collapse behind him. His perception did not care about the presence given off by the most basic lines. He only looked at the most basic lines. So the scroll in his sight was completely different from what the surrounding people saw. What he saw was a yellowed remnant of a scroll. On the rough grass pulp paper, there were only 2 mountains drawn. One was thick, the other light. There were some white clouds floating above the mountain peak. In front of the 2 mountains, a large river flowed. The upper right corner of this painting was missing, so the light mountain was missing a corner, and the river was missing a section. Hundreds of ink lines of varying depths, or rather, sword intent, or seal scripts, formed such a picture. Chapter 136. Ding Ning looked silently at the mountain, the clouds, and the water. He quickly frowned deeply. Metal was heavier than water. When it fell into water, it would sink to the bottom. When ordinary wood was thrown into water, it would float to the surface. Clear energy would rise into the air, and turbid energy would sink to form dust. The movement of all things had their own characteristics and laws. All kinds of primal energies of the universe made up all things in the world. Even the smallest thing would leave behind traces when it passed through the world. A careful hunter could find the footprints of a deer in the grass. An ignorant but idle child could find the traces of a snail crawling through the grass in the morning. The origin of cultivation was to investigate the laws of all things, to sense the traces left behind by the minute flows of primal energies of the universe, and comprehend the paths that could change or guide these traces. What words and pictures wanted to describe was this kind of path, but this painting remnant scroll directly abandoned words and pictures to depict this kind of path. These were different methods of expression. But compared to the words, the painting remnant scroll was like a seal, a formation. The ink lines were seal scripts that could change and guide primal energies of the universe. Most cultivation methods were connected, and many paths had their own laws. So many cultivators with high cultivation would infer many things from one example. They would comprehend the unknown paths through the laws of many cultivation diagrams and seal scripts. Even these powerful cultivators who could infer many things from one example and feel a sense of familiarity when they saw certain lines would first search for the starting brush when comprehending a scroll like this. They would search for the first stroke of the cultivator who had left behind the scroll. When the principles were described, there would be a sequence of words. According to the narration of the cultivator who had left behind the scroll, it would be easier to understand the cultivation methods hidden within. But Ding Ning was different. Ding Ning started with essence. Based on his understanding of the cultivators who had cultivated the vital energy cultivation methods of the painting remnant scroll, and from the energies he had felt when he first stepped into Ink Garden, this painting remnant scroll's understanding of vital energy cultivation was far from the 9 death silkworms. So, he did not need to waste time studying the vital energy cultivation methods in the painting remnant scroll. He only needed to obtain some useful methods to fight enemies, swordsmanship, seal path. Therefore, he only needed to distinguish which of these ink stains had sword intent, which represented sword marks, and which had talisman intent that violently changed and twisted the chi of heaven and earth, which was the talisman Taoism used against the enemy. This might be difficult for others, or even impossible to do, but it was not difficult for Ding Ning. However, at this moment, what made him frown deeply was that on this scroll, the place where the sword intent was the strongest was at the edge of the damaged paper. The ink lines that had just risen up disappeared into the ruined mountain. In other words, the most valuable part of the painting to him was in the broken upper right corner. Therefore, what was missing in the upper right corner wasn't just a corner of the mountain, nor was it just a section of the tail of the river. There should be something even more important on the side of the mountain. Ding Ning knew that it should be a star, or a cold moon. Because he knew that someone from the Zhou family had once used a sword essence like that, this painting remnant scroll should not have been damaged to such a degree. That person from the Zhou family had purposefully dug out some parts of the corner. It was this missing part that was his true purpose for coming here. He took a deep breath and removed all the other ink lines in his eyes. Only the ink lines with strong sword essence and the missing part were left in his eyes. Time slowly passed. He remembered all of these ink lines clearly. Then he pulled his gaze away from the painting and slowly turned around. More than an hour had passed. Xie Changsheng and the others still could not see anything and continued to look at the painting. After a few breaths, they felt dizzy. When Ding Ning's body moved, they immediately reacted. "What are you doing?" Xie Changsheng looked in puzzlement at Ding Ning, who had turned around. "Finished looking? You can't see anything, or?" Ding Ning glanced at him and said, "I have some doubts. I will go outside and think alone." Zhou Xie had been observing Ding Ning's expression all this time. Seeing Ding Ning just now frown deeply, he thought that Ding Ning could not see anything. He was slightly irritated and needed to calm himself. So he said coldly, "Please do as you wish.
Do not waste time.
Look slowly. I will return in a moment," Ding Ning said, and then walked out of the ancient hall. He only walked a few steps on the path outside the ancient hall. Then he raised his head and felt the flows of primal energies of the universe in Ink Garden. As expected, the corners of his mouth curled up slightly, and he showed a hint of disdain. As expected, you are not dead. When the Zhou family had built the Ink Garden, they had merged their comprehension of the painting remnant scroll into it. However, most of the comprehension had not been complete or had deviated. So the entire Ink Garden had not become a powerful formation. But maybe many years later, the presence of nature from the painting remnant scroll could cause some of the scenery in Ink Garden to change slightly. Those members of the Zhou family who had enough comprehension of the painting remnant scroll could sense their mistakes and correct them. At the same time, they could comprehend more. This was an effective but very stupid and time-consuming method of comprehension. But when one was at the limit, this was the only way to progress. But now, as he sensed the essence of Ink Garden, Ding Ning's perception found that most of it was still filled with errors. Many generations of cultivators of the Zhou family had only comprehended so much of the painting remnant scroll. Yet in a corner of Ink Garden, there was a place with the strongest presence. That was an arc-shaped courtyard. So even though they could not understand many parts of the painting remnant scroll or had misunderstood, the Zhou family happened to understand the part with the strongest sword essence on the painting remnant scroll. At this time, the courtyard that corresponded to the place with the strongest sword essence on the scroll had a stronger presence than on the scroll. So the Zhou family had comprehended that the person on the scroll was still alive. Most of the missing parts on the scroll had been dug out by him. At this time, that person was living in that courtyard. So many people have died without leaving behind any traces, but you are still alive. Ding Ning's disdain grew, but his expression slowly recovered its calmness. He even looked at the courtyard for a moment. Then he slowly turned and started to walk back to the ancient hall where the scroll was sealed. Xie Changsheng felt a slight wind behind him. Before he could turn his head, Ding Ning had walked to his side. "What did you see? Did you comprehend anything?" He could not help but ask Ding Ning softly. Ding Ning looked calmly at him. He did not answer his question and asked in return, "What did you see?" "I can't see at all," Xie Changsheng said with slight annoyance. "After looking for so long, I barely saw two blobs of ink that seemed to be two mountains. You can only see these two mountains, so you can only see these two mountains." Ding Ning looked coldly at him and said softly in a voice only the two of them could hear, "You can't even see the two mountains clearly. Why are you so greedy to look at other things?" Xie Chongsheng stilled. Ding Ning continued, "There are too many mountains. You can only look at the place you feel you can see more clearly on the two mountains." This is a grandmaster who surpasses most of the present grandmasters. Even if you are a grandmaster now, do you think you can see the whole picture? After saying this, Ding Ning reached out his right hand, placed it in front of Xie Chongsheng and slowly moved it past. His right hand covered Xie Chongsheng's eyes, but there was a small gap between his index and middle fingers. As his palm moved, only a small section of the ink line passed through the gap and fell into Xie Chongsheng's eyes. Xie Chongsheng could not sense the exquisite and minute changes in energy between Ding Ning's fingers, but he finally saw several ink lines clearly, several ink lines with feeling. His breathing completely stopped. When Ding Ning's hand disappeared in front of his eyes, he instinctively narrowed his eyes, put his hand in front of him, and moved it slowly. Ding Ning walked to Zhang Yi next to him. Zhang Yi was the one with the deepest frown at this moment. "Senior sect brother, what is it that you find difficult to understand?" Ding Ning asked softly. Zhang Yi suddenly started. He seemed to realize it was Ding Ning. Then he said softly with a serious and worried frown, "I chose the simplest part to look at. The simplest part of the scroll is at the top. The lines are sparse, like several white clouds, but the faint lines of these white clouds are difficult to understand. I feel there is true meaning, but I cannot sense what it is. One day is clearly not enough time. If I have a few months, I may understand." Ding Ning looked forward calmly. He also looked at the white clouds and said seriously, "Senior sect brother, you are indeed talented and have understood, but I feel that these white clouds only have a shape. The bottom is faint, but there is water. The faint lines are flat, but they seem to have the intention of going down, as though these clouds will turn into rain." Zhang Yi's body suddenly trembled, but he did not dare to look away from the white clouds. As Ding Ning spoke, the white clouds seemed to move according to his will, and then turned into rain in his eyes. Chapter 137. This was the most valuable epiphany on the path of cultivation. This was an indescribable feeling. Zhang Yi was shocked and overjoyed. The white clouds turned to rain. With each drop of rain, many lines he had not been able to see before would appear. He completely sensed the true meaning of these lines. He was so shocked and overjoyed he could not help but say in a trembling voice, "Little sect brother, it really is rain, not clouds." Xin Yi turned to look at him in puzzlement. Zhang Yi finally realized that the little sect brother of White Goat Cave was not Ding Ning, but Xin Yi. Zhou Xie's face was slightly pale. Looking at Zhang Yi's state, he thought in disbelief. Had Zhang Yi really comprehended something from the painting remnant scroll in such a short time? Zhang Yi looked at Ding Ning. He saw Ding Ning had walked next to Nangong Kaishu. At this time, a thin wave of primal energies of the universe slowly came out of the painting remnant scroll. Zhang Yi stilled. He immediately reacted. Just now, when he had an epiphany, his mental power had unconsciously moved along those seal lines. This had already affected the qi movement. Sensing the moisture in the thin primal energies of the universe, his breathing paused slightly. He was even more excited because he was certain that his epiphany just now was correct. He had comprehended the true meaning of those white clouds, but were actually rain lines. Zhou Xie's face paled even more, and his body completely froze. While the primal energies of the universe slowly coming out of the painting remnant scroll were thin, they were exceptionally clear and floated high into the sky. At this time, all of Chongling outside of Ink Garden was bright and sunny. But the sky above Ink Garden was suddenly damp. Multiple balls of white clouds suddenly formed and blocked the sunlight. Everyone in front of the painting remnant scroll finally sensed this change. Even Nangong Kaishu, who had been completely immersed in the scene ahead of her, woke up. On a small mountain in Ink Garden, in the study of the Cloud Sea Pavilion, Zhou Yunhai was drinking tea with Shui Wangshu. The tea was the extremely expensive cloud mist tea. The teacups were also made of mystic-colored porcelain, as if they were frozen. The mouth of the teacup seemed to be surrounded by clouds. Zhou Yunhai's expression changed slightly as he felt the moisture in the air in front of him. The teacup in his hand trembled slightly. Xue Wangxiu's eyes lit up slightly as he praised, "The painting remnant scroll is truly extraordinary." Zhou Yunhai took a deep breath and said slowly, "Xue's disciple is truly extraordinary." While they were talking, the lower parts of the white clouds started to fade. However, it wasn't that the wetness disappeared, but that the wetness was so heavy that it finally condensed into raindrops. Countless raindrops fell from the sky, bringing with them countless sparkling lines of rain. Under the clear sky, it rained in Ink Garden. Looking at the concept of the pouring rain, Zhou Xiei's face paled even more. He was certain that this was something no one in the Zhou family had comprehended before. He couldn't help but look at Zhang Yi and ask, "What have you comprehended?" "It should be a seal essence. It can become a sword seal, or be used in forging. It is a method to fight enemies." Zhang Yi was a gentleman, so he answered Zhou Xiei's question truthfully. "Junior sect brother Ding Ning." In the next moment, he looked at the calm Ding Ning and felt a mixture of emotions. Only he understood that just now his epiphany was like he had found many doors but could not enter. Then Ding Ning had kicked him into a door, and there was true meaning behind that door. "Congratulations, senior sect brother." Ding Ning looked at him and said softly, "Do not thank me. You should know that this is a coincidence. No grandmaster can see the true meaning of this painting scroll so quickly. This is just a coincidence." Zhang Yi thought back to Ding Ning's words. He felt it was reasonable. He was certain that a grandmaster like Xue Wangxiu should be much weaker than the person who had left behind this painting scroll. In all of Chongling, there were not many people higher in cultivation than Xue Wangxiu. At this time, to his and everyone's shock, the painting remnant scroll in front of them once again released a wave of primal energies of the universe. But this wave of primal energies of the universe quickly scattered like someone had just drawn a brush and then immediately stopped.
Dang.
A muffled sound came from the air in Ink Garden like someone had struck an invisible copper bell. What is going on? Nangong Kaishu looked left and right in shock. Her and everyone else's gazes landed on Xie Chongqing, who had his hand in front of him. Xie Chongqing's expression was very strange and spectacular. "I seem to have comprehended something, but not completely, he said embarrassedly. Then he put his hand in front of his eyes and continued to look at the painting scroll. What was this? He could look at the painting remnant scroll with his hand in front of his eyes and comprehend from it? Zhou Xie thought with a stiff body. He suddenly thought of what Ding Ning had done to Xie Chongqing. He felt even more disbelief and couldn't help but turn to look at Ding Ning. "Just now you are so focused. What do you see?" Ding Ning asked Nangong Kaishu softly. "I see a river." Nangong Kaishu looked at Ding Ning and said, "For some reason, there are many things in this painting, but I seem to only see this river." Ding Ning said calmly in a low voice, "This is normal. Everyone has different eyes, likes, and dislikes. Every cultivator cultivates different things. When looking at seals or diagrams like this, there will naturally be differences." Nangong Kaishu nodded and said, "My father said something similar. I thought that if I could comprehend something, then I could only comprehend something from this river. So I searched for what attracted me the most in this river." Ding Ning said, "This is the right thing to do?" Nangong Kaishu said, "What seems to be attracting me right now are the waves in the river. Those waves seem very interesting. Normal waves would not form like that and would not rise and fall like that. But I have no clue as to the true meaning within." Ding Ning looked silently at the painting scroll. After half an hour, he said, "If those waves are created by fish tails going against the flow of the river, then it is normal." Nangong Kaishu stilled. When she looked at the waves again, she couldn't help but think that there really seemed to be a few fishes swimming against the current under the water. In the evening, the ginseng tea on the tea table had been replaced with exquisite little desserts. Zhou Yunhai's expression was calm, but his mind was slightly restless.
Bam.
At this time, a bell sounded in the air. His heart suddenly sank. Compared to the half-broken bell from 4 hours ago, this bell was exceptionally long and even gave people the feeling that it was echoing in the distant valleys. In the northwest corner of Engarden, Ding Ning sensed the strongest presence in the small courtyard with white walls and black tiles. It looked no different from a small courtyard in an ordinary village. Yet in one of the halls, there were tiger skins spread out. Each tiger skin clearly came from a strong adult tiger, and each was extremely large when spread out on the ground. There was a red bead the size of a fist hanging on a soft couch in the hall. While the bead was emitting a scorching hot aura, it was also emitting a bloody and ruthless aura. Only in the body of some ferocious beasts could such an inner core be formed. The burning presence was heavy as it slowly landed on the tiger skin on the ground. The heat spread along the ends of the fur. Yes, this hall was as warm as spring, and the heat was unusually even. An old man sat on a soft couch covered in brocade that was even silkier than a young girl's skin. His silver hair was combed until it shone. There were no wrinkles on his face, and his skin gave off a jade-like luster. The heat coming off his body was just as strong, and would cause any cultivator to feel their energies and vitality. However, there was also a sense of age that was constantly being emitted from his body. It was as if there was a lot of filthy dust lingering around him all the time. Under his golden brocade robe, his abdomen was unusually swollen like a woman who had been pregnant for 10 months. But the left side of his abdomen was strangely empty. That place seemed to have been slashed by a sword. Not only were large chunks of flesh and bones missing, but even a part of the internal organs seemed to be missing. To be able to survive such a serious injury, it was not easy at all. This old man's gaze kept drifting outside the window as though he was terrified and disgusted by his own body. His gaze rarely touched his body. His gaze was filled with many negative emotions: hatred, unwillingness, greed, viciousness. This caused his clean face to appear slightly vicious. The sun was about to set. The bell had stopped ringing. Yet several unique sword essences appeared in the cold air like swimming fish in the air above Engarden. Then there was another thunderous sound that rolled down from the sky. When he heard the previous bell ringing, this old man knew that something unusual was happening in Engarden today. When he sensed the two presences coming out of the painting remnant scroll, he no longer had any doubts. He wanted to know the true reason for this unusual event. So he stood up from the couch. The moment he stood up, all the negative and ruthless emotions in his eyes disappeared and turned into kindness. He put on a fox fur coat to cover his abdomen. He looked like an extremely kind and benevolent old man. Chapter 138. In front of the painting remnant scroll, Zhou Xie, the once proud young genius of Chongling, had an ashen face. His heart was slightly numb from the continuous attacks of energy coming from the painting scroll. Zhang Yi comprehended something and caused a heavy rain to fall in Engarden. Xie Chongsheng comprehended something. Strange sounds exploded in the air of Engarden like the ringing of an enormous bell and echoed through the mountains. Nangong Kaishu comprehended something. Several strange sword essences suddenly appeared in the ancient hall like fish swimming against the flow of the river, splashing and moving unpredictably. Su Heshan comprehended something. There seemed to be an invisible mountain in the sky, and enormous boulders were rolling down like thunder. They were all shocked speechless. They were still thinking back to those lines and conceptions, afraid they would forget. Only Shun Yi was ashamed. Senior sect brother, I still cannot see anything. He turned to look at Ding Ning next to him and said softly, I do not sense the echo of an empty valley between the two mountains, nor do I sense the boulders rolling down the mountain. I used Xie Chongsheng's method and saw nothing special in the ink lines. Everyone has different strengths. Ding Ning looked at the ashamed Shun Yi and said calmly, It is your strength to see other people's strengths, but it is your fault to learn from other people's strengths. Guanzhong has 800 miles of fertile land. You are usually broad-minded and broad-minded. So you can see the big picture. You can see the color of the two mountains. You only need to look at the color of the two mountains. Shin Yi was stunned and said to himself, What is the use of just looking at the colors? Ding Ning looked coolly at him and said, The sun is set and the sky is dark. Shen Yi was even more stunned. He did not understand why Ding Ning would say such a thing. When we came, the sun was high and bright, but now the sky is dark. Ding Ning continued calmly. But look at the color of the two mountains. Has it changed? Shen Yi's body suddenly shook. In the picture scroll in his eyes, all he could see was a black mountain and a faint white mountain. It was no different from when he first arrived. In the dark light, it was still as clear as before. The black didn't become darker, and the white was still faint, as if it was eternal. A light seemed to flash through his mind. His vision suddenly cleared, and he instinctively tried to catch the ink lines that made the black and white unchanging. His mind was immediately immersed in it. I have never heard of this before. At this moment, a kind and gentle voice sounded outside the ancient palace. I had never thought that there was a way to comprehend the painting scroll like this. I had never thought that Changling's youth would have such insight. Hearing this voice, Zhou Xie's eyes filled with awe. Thinking that it was because of him that so many outsiders had entered in garden and obtained such benefits, he was filled with terror. He turned and knelt down to the person outside the ancient hall. He said in a trembling voice, "Old ancestor." A hint of coldness flashed through Ding Ning's eyes. But the moment he turned, it melted like ice and turned into calm water. He turned to look at the old man dressed in grand silver fox fur robes who had appeared at the entrance. Other than Shen Yi, who was in a wondrous state, Zhang Yi, Xie Changsheng, and the others turned in shock to look at this old man who had suddenly appeared. When Zhou Xie's voice echoed in their ears and they saw Zhou Xie's kneeling body on the ground, Zhang Yi was the first to think of a possibility. You. His face was filled with disbelief, as if he had just realized something. Could you be Senior Zhou Rongma? What? Xie Changsheng almost instinctively exclaimed. How is this possible? It did sound impossible. The Zhou family had an old ancestor called Zhou Rongma. He was the only person who could comprehend a cultivation method from the painting remnant scroll and comprehend 3 sword moves from it. But that person had to be traced back several generations from Zhou Xie. In the era of the previous emperor of the Qin dynasty, he had been many years old. The legend said that in the bloody storm years before the Yuanwu emperor ascended the throne, this old ancestor of the Zhou family had been killed with one blow. His intestines had been pierced through, and his blood had spilled over many streets. How could a person like this still be alive? Hearing Xie Changsheng's exclamation, this benevolent and amiable old man smiled warmly and said emotionally, "Old but not dead, it is this old man." Nangong Kaishu and Su Heshan were also filled with shock. The two of them were descendants of generals. Compared to Zhang Yi and Xie Changsheng, they knew more of Changling's past. This was an existence that had experienced 2 generations of emperors of the Qin dynasty, the glory and decline of the old nobility, the reform, and the Yuanwu emperor's ascension. They even knew that during the reform, this old man had once been an enemy of the Yuanwu emperor. But after the Yuanwu emperor's situation was set, and in the bloody storm before his ascension, he and the Zhou family had accepted the last chance the Yuanwu emperor gave them to fight for the Yuanwu emperor. So while the Zhou family had declined, they were still able to survive in Chongling and had vast lands. But the rumors said that the battle had been terrible. Forefather Zhou, like many other experts, had died with incomplete bodies. Who would have thought that this forefather Zhou was still alive in the Garden of Zhou? Forefather Zhou Rongma smiled benevolently. His gaze landed on Ding Ning. He said kindly, "Just now, I coincidentally heard your words of advice to your junior sect brother. Even I feel enlightened. Allow me to guess, are the successive people comprehending in this painting related to you?" Ding Ning frowned slightly as though he did not know what to say. Forefather Zhou's eyes flashed with an unusual light. He praised, "It seems that it is true. Can you really understand the entire painting?" Other than Shen Yi, everyone present knew that their comprehension came from Ding Ning's enlightenment. But when they heard Forefather Zhou's words, they still felt it was impossible. Because there was likely no grandmaster in Chongling who could understand the entire painting remnant scroll. Other than the strongest Qin emperor in history, the Yuanwu emperor? At this time, the silent painting remnant scroll gave off another wave of energy. Zhang Yi and the others, including Zhou Xie, who had just stood up from the ground, suddenly turned around. The moment they turned, threads of unique primal energies of the universe turned into countless bright rays of light. Everyone in the ancient palace felt as if they had suddenly welcomed a grand sunrise. The transparent crystal wall that sealed the scroll seemed to burn at this moment. It became extremely dazzling, turning into two extremely dazzling balls of light. Then the entire ancient hall seemed to turn into transparent crystal and continued to give off pure and transparent light. The light swept through all the black and white energies in Ink Garden. Then, in the next moment, all the black and white disappeared for a moment. Countless colors seemed to return in this moment. The hall, the streams, the grass and trees all returned to their original colors. Although the sun had already set and the sky was dark, the scene of everything suddenly returning to its original color was so magnificent that it could not be described with words. In fact, it was even moving. Senior sect brother Ding Ning. I really seem to have comprehended something. Shunyi's joyful voice sounded at this time. Up until now, he had not had the time to detect that an old person had appeared in the hall. Everyone looked at Ding Ning with different emotions in their eyes. Of course, I cannot understand the entire painting. Ding Ning spoke at this time and said, I am just borrowing power. Senior sect brother? Shun Yi was slightly dazed. He finally discovered that there was an additional person. Zhang Yi waved his hand at him, indicating for him not to miss the chance to continue comprehending and not to interrupt. Borrowing power? Forefather Zhou looked at Ding Ning's eyes and wanted to see something. Ding Ning nodded and said, when my senior sect brother Zhang Yi said he saw clouds, I suddenly saw clouds and guessed there was rain. When Nangong Kaishu said she saw a river, I saw a river. When she said the waves were different from usual, I guessed it was the splashing of fish tails. When Su Heshan saw a tall mountain, he saw rocks on the mountain that seemed to be unsteady. I guess the rolling rocks on the mountain had deeper meaning. I only saw things based on their foundation and made my thoughts. However, what they have comprehended, I am unable to comprehend. I am unable to comprehend the true meaning within. After a pause, Ding Ning said calmly, and with some regret, so they have all gained something, but I have not comprehended anything. I have not even comprehended one sword form or one seal essence. How can I understand the entire painting? Junior sect brother, you may have been busy thinking for us, so you did not have the time to comprehend. Otherwise, with your talent, how can it be that you have not comprehended anything? Hearing Ding Ning's words, Zhang Yi's face burned. Thinking that as the eldest senior brother, he had not fulfilled his duty as a senior brother, he felt extremely guilty. You can see what others see, and you can infer the possibilities. This is also an astounding talent. Forefather Zhou's benevolent and amiable expression turned solemn. He hesitated for a moment, and then seemed to make a decision. He looked at Ding Ning with a sincere and pleading gaze and said, I have encountered a serious obstacle in my comprehension of some things. Even if your cultivation is not as good as mine, some of your ideas may be able to inject new blood into my cultivation path. Can you spend some time to accompany me to take a look? Chapter 139. Everyone was shocked speechless. Forefather Zhou was asking a young person for advice on cultivation. This sounded impossible, but it was happening right in front of them. Ding Ning thought for a moment and said, I do not dare. Forefather Zhou's expression grew gentler. He said with a smile, there is a time of birth, but there is no order in comprehension. Ding Ning frowned slightly and did not immediately agree. Forefather Zhou did not show any impatience. He maintained his amiable smile and said, just now, you said to your junior sect brother that everyone has their own strengths. In cultivation and comprehension, the most important thing is opportunity. You did not gain anything here, but maybe you will gain something at my place. Zhang Yi was moved. He felt that Forefather Zhou's words were reasonable. He turned to look at Ding Ning, hoping that Ding Ning would not miss this chance. Ding Ning glanced at him and finally spoke. If that is the case, This junior will be disrespectful. Forefather Zhou was overjoyed. He took a step forward and took Ding Ning's hand. He said, "Come with me." Seeing Forefather Zhou so amiable and kind, and think so highly of Ding Ning, Zhang Yi, Xie Changsheng, and the others exchanged a look. They were overjoyed and hoped that Ding Ning would have some astounding fortuitous encounters this time. But at this time, Ding Ning, who was being led out by Forefather Zhou, sneered even more inside. The moment she held his hand, there was a wave of vital energy that ordinary cultivators could not sense, but he could clearly sense. It was extremely weak, but extremely penetrative. It circulated through his body. This was Forefather Zhou testing him. It was just that all the little silkworms in his body had disappeared without a trace. Even Fang Shumu couldn't sense anything unusual that day. How could he discover his secret with such a probing today? Today, countless people in Chongling knew that they had entered the Zhou family ink garden. Even with Xie Changsheng, Nangong Kaishu, and Su Hashan's background, the Zhou family could not afford to offend them. Forefather Zhou was also so benevolent and amiable that people thought of Shui Wangshu. So Zhang Yi, Nangong Kaishu, and the others did not feel that there would be a problem if Ding Ning and Forefather Zhou went to ink garden alone. But Ding Ning knew that there would be a problem. Forefather Zhou's expression was extremely gentle, as though that probing thread of vital energy did not exist and had not come from his body. Gentle energy wrapped around his and Ding Ning's bodies and brought them into the courtyard he lived in. But then, he did not go to his bedroom, but to the garden in the courtyard. The garden was at the center of the small courtyard. There was a fake mountain and a small pond with lotus flowers. At this time, the lotus leaves were defeated, and the pond was only left with a thin layer of ice. In addition, the sky was dark, and the place had returned to its pure black and white color, so the pond looked indescribably bleak. The pieces of defeated lotus leaves did not look like lotus leaves, but instead looked like strange ghosts. "Do not panic." Forefather Zhou walked towards the pond and said softly to Ding Ning. The moment his feet touched the thin ice on the pond, a thin wave of primal energies of the universe slowly came out of his body. A layer of fine water droplets suddenly appeared between his feet and the thin ice. The fine water droplets seemed to pass through the ice like invisible objects and seeped down. A straight path suddenly appeared between the thin ice and the withered lotus leaves. It split to the sides and revealed a stone staircase that led deep underground. This pond covered in thin ice was already colder than the surroundings. However, there was an even more biting cold that continuously rose from the stone steps. Sensing this coldness, Ding Ning's body reacted like an ordinary cultivator, trembling slightly. His mind was very calm. He knew what he needed was in the secret room below. The smell of dust filled Forefather Zhou's nose. As he slowly walked down the stone steps, true emotion appeared in his eyes. He remembered that it had been a few years since he last entered this secret chamber. Because a few years ago, he already felt that he could no longer comprehend anything more. A treasure mountain was right in front of him, but he couldn't enter it. This kind of great pain made him even unwilling to look at the things inside. A black metal door appeared in Ding Ning's sight. This black metal door was covered in white frost. There were many seemingly disorderly carved lines on it, but Ding Ning knew that these carved lines were related to many of the lines on the painting scroll. When Forefather Zhou approached the metal door, his body and the door seemed to resonate. Two waves of primal energies of the universe collided slightly. The white frost on the metal door turned to dust, and the black metal door suddenly moved backwards. Ahead was a dark and empty underground palace. There was no light from any fire, but in the pure darkness, there was a ball of white flame. Ding Ning narrowed his eyes slightly. This was a remnant scroll. Like the painting remnant scroll in the painting, it was sealed in 2 layers of pure and transparent crystal. "It really is a cold moon," Ding Ning said slowly in his heart. A crescent moon was drawn on the yellowed paper several feet long. The crescent moon outlined by several ink lines was now emitting true light and coldness.
Boom.
A muffled sound rang out. The metal door closed behind him. Forefather Zhou, whose face was pale from the light of the white flame, could not help but breathe faster. He asked softly, "What do you see?" Ding Ning said calmly, "It seems to be a crescent moon with sword essence." Forefather Zhou's eyes immediately brightened. This was an astounding answer. There had been so many cultivators in the Zhou family for generations, but no one had been able to see the crescent moon and sword essence the first time they stood in front of this remnant. Not even he could do it. He started to confirm that Ding Ning really had astounding comprehension talent. His breathing sped up uncontrollably, and burning desire and greed flowed through his eyes. This is the missing corner of the painting remnant scroll outside. Even in the era of the previous emperor, the top cultivators of the world did not have the chance to see this thing. This is something the Zhou family spent great effort and paid a great price to preserve. Since you have such a chance today, you should take a good look. Forefather Zhou exhaled some hot air and tried to speak as slowly and clearly as possible. This corner has an opportunity with me. When I first started to comprehend this painting scroll, what attracted me the most was this corner. I spent almost 100 years. At the start, I discovered that the seal lines of this crescent moon were vital energy cultivation methods. Then I discovered that the light of this crescent moon was the true path of the sword. So this crescent moon doesn't just contain a powerful sword manual, it also contains a powerful vital energy cultivation method. True pain appeared in Forefather Zhou's eyes. When comprehending the path, I naturally felt great joy. But after cultivating, I sank into true perplexity. The vital energy cultivation method and sword manual contained in this crescent moon seem to be incomplete. I do not know if there is a problem with my comprehension or this remnant corner, because while this remnant corner was cut from the scroll outside, it is still missing a piece of the crescent moon. I do not know if there is something important missing from the crescent moon. Listening carefully to Forefather Zhou's narration, Ding Ning slowly nodded and said calmly, "Let me take a look." His state of mind became absolutely calm. His eyes fell on the simple ink lines of the crescent moon. His perception quickly spread out along with the countless faint white rays of light. His perception was limited and could not even pass through the heavy metal door. But the direction of these lines of light caused a scene high up in the sky to appear in his mind. He seemed to be standing high up in the sky and watching these lines of light pass around him. In the sky, there were dots of primal energies of the universe that most cultivators would never be able to touch in their entire lives. Many of the primal energies of the universe that flashed with white and pure light slowly gathered on these lines of light and then descended. Ding Ning frowned slightly. He understood. These lines were not a direct method to fight the enemy, but a method that cultivators use to absorb primal energies of the universe. He took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. He gathered his thoughts, and his gaze once again landed on the seal lines that formed the crescent moon. The seal lines quickly flowed in his eyes. The simple seal lines spun in different ways, but in his perception, they became a diagram of meridians. The lines of light that had just absorbed primal energies of the universe in his mind overlapped with this diagram of meridians. He saw the dots of primal energies of the universe seeping into the meridians and settling down. His brow immediately furrowed deeply. Forefather Zhou's comprehension was not wrong. Or rather, all of Forefather Zhou's previous comprehensions and his present comprehension did not differ. Forefather Zhou was also right. This cultivation method of combining vital energy and sword manual was not complete. Ding Ning was certain that if he cultivated this way, some of the energy would not be controlled by the cultivator and would continue to settle down. But was there really something missing from this corner of the scroll? He did not think so. His gaze started to stop at the empty space above the crescent moon. Then his deeply furrowed brow relaxed. Just like curing a disease, he found the crux of the problem. While the moon was waning, it had times when it was full. Therefore, the large piece missing from this crescent moon was the most important invisible talisman line. This meant that when the moon was waning, it would become full, and when the moon was full, it would become a deficit. In his mind, the crescent moon slowly became full, and then waned when it reached its limit. This cycle changed, a new diagram of meridians appeared in his mind. He had completely solved the true meaning of this corner and obtained what he wanted. But his body also shook slightly. If one was too full, they would turn into a deficit. This was a problem he had understood in the past but had neglected. "What do you feel?" Forefather Zhou asked as he felt his body shake. His breathing stopped and his heart beat wildly. Chapter 140. The true meaning was in his mind, and he could speak as he pleased.
Ding Ning pondered what to say.
After a moment, Forefather Zhou could not suppress himself and said, "If you can really help me, I will repay you. I can tell you the cultivation method I comprehended from this cold moon." Hearing this, Ding Ning's expression was still calm, but the disdain in his heart burned like wildfire on the grasslands. He could not see Forefather Zhou's abdomen under his silver fox fur coat, but he could imagine that the energy in this forefather's abdomen was bulging, and the vital energy in his jade palace was as hard as metal. "There may be a problem with this cold moon." He looked regretfully at Forefather Zhou and said, "I feel that the method itself may have some problems." Forefather Zhou sank into true shock. He took a deep breath and tried to disguise his true emotions. He even put on a humble posture and asked, "What do you think is the problem?" Ding Ning frowned and said, "Why is it not a rising sun, but a cold moon?" Forefather Zhou instinctively thought of the painting and could not understand. Ding Ning continued, "The painting clearly has shades. If it is a cold moon like this, then it will be like the cold winter night right now. Looking at the distant mountains, one will be immersed in darkness. How can one see the clear shades? How can one see the white clouds turning into rain? How can one see the rolling rocks of the mountains and the waves of fishtails?" Forefather Zhou's expression changed. He said in shock, "You mean that the painting should be daytime, but there is a cold moon. That is not right?" Ding Ning sneered inwardly. In reality, the Grandmaster who left behind this painting remnant scroll had great meaning. When the moon was full, the scenery of the distant mountains could be seen clearly. This would cause future generations to speculate why it was not a full moon, and then detect the most important seal character and the true meaning he wanted to express. Yet Forefather Zhou had studied for so many years without success. In terms of cultivation, knowledge, and comprehension, he was far from the Grandmaster who had left behind the painting remnant scroll. After so many years of thinking, his mind was probably a mess. So even though his words contained some true meaning, he did not worry that Forefather Zhou could obtain true comprehension. He sneered inwardly, but his expression was still unusually calm. "The presence of this crescent moon is too yin and cold." He nodded and then said, "Women are yin, men are yang. So I suspect that the method contained in this remnant corner may be one that only women can cultivate." Forefather Zhou paled and said, "A method for women?" Ding Ning said apologetically, "This junior does not know if my feeling is correct. I just feel that the other scrolls are all methods to fight enemies, but this is a cultivation method. This crescent moon is drawn in a corner, and it is so far away, so I suspect that the master who left behind this painting is most likely a woman. Her meaning is that the other parts of the painting can be comprehended and studied, but this corner is related to the cultivation of true essence, and only a woman can cultivate it." Forefather Zhou's breathing completely stopped. His body started to tremble. For a moment, there were countless sharp voices screaming in his mind at the same time. They were mocking and laughing wildly. Could it be that his entire life of cultivation was really incomparably laughable? That he had cultivated a cultivation method that only women could cultivate? His psychic power couldn't help but touch the hardened moon palace. He felt the swelling and sinking of his lower abdomen. His heart ached fiercely, but it was as if a streak of light flashed through his mind. Cold moon, menstruation. Was this really so? If a woman cultivated this fiendish energy that was too oppressive, she could naturally expel it during her menstruation, and her body would be unharmed. So the true meaning of this cold moon was like this? For a moment, his breathing became extremely rapid, and the aura on his body shook chaotically. even causing the entire oppressive underground palace to hum. The entire courtyard started to tremble. The vibrating air pressed into his ear. It was very uncomfortable. Ding Ning coughed softly and covered his ears. Forefather Zhou laughed bitterly. But he was a formidable person. At a time like this, he still controlled his emotions. Apologies. He looked at Ding Ning and said softly, I have embarrassed myself in front of you. Thinking that my hundreds of years of comprehension may have been wrong from the start, I am so disappointed. Ding Ning bowed slightly and said, This junior is afraid. This is just my opinion. It may not be correct. This may be built on the foundation of my many years of comprehension. This is a great possibility. Forefather Zhou bowed in return and said sorrowfully, I comprehended the vital energy circulation method and sword formula on this when I was 100 years old. At first, it was very powerful, but after using it for a while, the Jade Palace's vital energy started to condense. I thought this was the uniqueness of this method, and I could be reborn in the future, but the situation grew worse. If I was wrong from the start, and this is a method that only women can cultivate, then what do you think can be remedied? Ding Ning's gaze imperceptibly flashed. He bowed his head and said, If there is such a possibility as to remedy, Elder, your understanding of cultivation should surpass mine. Since it is extreme cold, in my view, I can only use extreme yang energy to counteract it. Forefather Zhou's mind settled slightly. He suddenly reflected and found that he had lost his sense of propriety. Then a thread of hope rose in his despondent heart. If he could use extreme yang energy to counteract the Jade Palace's vital energy, as long as the Jade Palace's vital energy could be used again, even if he did not use the vital energy circulation method on the diagram and did not use that kind of sword essence with his present cultivation, he feared that he could surpass his peak in the past and rise again in Chongling. For extreme yang energy items to enter the energy sea, they have to merge into the 5 energies. Forefather Zhou looked at Ding Ning and said probingly, Then there must be a spirit medicine of the universe that nourishes yang energy. Ding Ning said calmly, I think so. Forefather Zhou was silent. Moments later, he recovered his benevolent and amiable expression. He said gently, I will send you out now. When he turned and walked a few steps, his energy clashed with the energy on the black metal door. When the metal door opened again, his footsteps paused and he said softly, If you feel it is useful, I can tell you the cultivation method I comprehended from this corner. While only women can cultivate it according to what you said, it is very powerful against enemies. Also, if you do not cultivate it to a certain level, you will not need a long time and there will be no harm. For you, it may be useful in the short term. Are you really so kind? You didn't even let go of an unfamiliar young man who might be of help to you. You just wanted me to cultivate this kind of technique. In the end, you wanted to see if I, who was in the same situation as you, would be able to find something useful to you. Ding Ning sneered inside, but he showed shock on his face. He said in a trembling voice, Is this really possible? Forefather Zhou smiled slightly and said, Ever since you entered Ink Garden, I received a report. I know that you are ranked on the ranking of talents and will attend the Min Mountain Sword trials this summer. I think that the cultivation method I comprehended from this corner of the painting remnant scroll will be of great use to you in the Min Mountain Sword trials. Of course, after I tell you later, you can consider whether to cultivate it. Ding Ning took a deep breath. Looking at the other's back, he said, How can I repay Elder's kindness? Forefather Zhou smiled and said, Then when I think of something you can help with, just do your best to help me. It sounded bold and unrestrained. However, his eyes were cold and filled with ruthlessness. Night fell completely, and the sky was dotted with stars. Xia Chongsheng, Zhang Yi, and the others grew anxious as they waited, especially when they did not know what had happened when the ground had trembled slightly. They could not help but worry about Ding Ning's safety. At this time, a Zhou family attendant came with a lantern. She bowed to the people in front of the painting remnant scroll and said, My family's forefather is personally teaching Mr. Ding cultivation methods. It may take some time. Forefather has ordered a banquet to be prepared in the pavilion of Ink Garden for everyone. You can go eat first, and he will personally send Mr. Ding over. Even Forefather Zhou is going to teach him some cultivation methods. Ding Ning is really... Xie Chongsheng and the others who did not understand thought that Ding Ning's talent caused Forefather Zhou to like him. They were shocked and envious. In a quiet room in the courtyard, Ding Ning sat with his eyes closed as Forefather Zhou slowly narrated. In the span of a few breaths, the meridian diagram clearly appeared in Ding Ning's mind. He used his consciousness to look inside, and the 12 meridians in his body were peeled off. In the corner of the painting remnant scroll, the key meridian points of the 12 meridians were strung together like countless silver beads. They were densely packed and resonated with the countless paths in his mind. In his perception, countless white threads of light suddenly appeared in the world around him. He opened his body and allowed these white threads of light to connect with the silver bead-like meridians in his body. The moment they connected, he sensed countless of primal energies of the universe slipping through these white threads of light and entering the meridians in his body. Those meridians lit up one after another like bright lamps. When all the meridians lit up, the dots of primal energies of the universe connected into one and started to flow. They turned into a cold and murderous flow that was extremely heavy like metal. After the dots of primal energies of the universe were absorbed into his 12 meridians, the cold and murderous flow grew stronger. In his perception, it started to give off a deep black. Following his thoughts, the black chi flow instantly suppressed a certain meridian point in one of the meridians. With a boom, this black flow of energy suddenly compressed and transformed into a thin black crystal that settled in that meridian. It was a thin piece of crystal, but it also looked like a small sword that was as thin as ice. It also looked like a piece of crystal rune. Chapter 141. As expected, it is the distant star fiendish energy. Once this thin black crystal formed and was embedded in the meridian point, there was a slight stabbing pain. Ding Ning's mind shifted, and he left his perception. He opened his eyes and woke up. There were countless kinds of primordial chi in the world, such as the withering and flourishing of plants, the burning of wood, wind, thunder, rain, and lightning. No one knew how much primordial chi was active among them, but the primordial chi in the human world could not be separated from the combination and change of the original primordial chi of the world. Yet in this world, there were also the energies of the sun, moon, and stars from the outside, especially the star energies that came from the distant stars. No one knew how many lightless, cold, and desolate spaces they had to pass through. The coldness and size of those spaces were unimaginable even to cultivators. The star energies that passed through the endless cold spaces and landed in this world were usually tainted with the energies of the extreme fiendish energies and were not compatible with the bodies of cultivators. However, those with great abilities were able to make use of it and comprehend the method to absorb and use the cold fiendish star yuan qi. The most important corner of the painting remnant scroll recorded such a method. Ding Ning could sense that Na Hanji's fiendish energy had formed a sword. With a thought, the crystal sword that had just formed in his body would fly out like a flying sword. Although it was unable to change according to one's will like a real flying sword, it was extremely strange and unpredictable. However, because this object was condensed from the star-cold baleful yuan qi, its power was extremely shocking. Coupled with the fact that it could suddenly be used against an enemy, it was extremely difficult for the enemy to guard against it. These 12 meridians could absorb and form 24 of these fiendish little swords stored in 24 meridian points. According to the true meaning of profit and loss of the moon, the correct method was to absorb these 24 little swords and then send them out according to unique seal lines. The moment the 20 meridian points were empty, they would absorb large amounts of primal energies of the universe beneficial to the cultivator's body and merge the energies. This was a method recorded in the cultivation records to absorb water, the true path of profit and loss. But Forefather Zhou's knowledge and understanding were limited. He only understood the method to fight the enemy and did not understand the true meaning of cultivation. No wonder you are the genius who set the newest cultivation record in Chongling. You can comprehend the method I told you so quickly and condense fiendish energies so quickly. The moment Ding Ning opened his eyes, Forefather Zhou sent a bit of vital energy into Ding Ning's body. When he sensed the cold little sword in that meridian point, he immediately sighed. To be able to condense such a sword, the other 23 swords are naturally not a problem. You have already grasped the true technique. You should feel that this cold little sword is harmful to your body, but it should not be a problem to maintain your body for half a year. It is enough for you to deal with the Min Mountain Sword trials. After sighing, he looked gently at Ding Ning and said, half a year wouldn't be a problem? Sensing the chip that was embedded in the orifice like a real ice chip, Ding Ning was certain that it was exactly half a year ago. If he really used Forefather Zhou's erroneous methods, in half a year, the Jade Palace and his energy sea would freeze under the energy of these fiendish little swords. When he fought the enemy, his Jade Palace and celestial aperture would not flow smoothly, and he feared that he would only be able to use a fraction of his vital energy. That would be the start of the Min Mountain Sword trials. If he could only rely on these 24 fiendish little swords and a fraction of his cultivation to fight the enemy, he would be in a terrible state. While he thought so, Ding Ning had a sincere expression of gratitude. He bowed deeply and said, "Thank you, Forefather, for the scripture. If I need it in the future, I will do my best." They both had their own plans. Forefather Zhou's heart was dark, but he had a bright smile on his face. He said in a harmonious voice, "Little friend is too polite. With your talent, the Zhou family ink garden will be proud of you in the future." In the past, the old nobility had been extremely extravagant in food. While the Zhou family had declined and the ingredients used were ordinary, the finesse was not something ordinary people could imagine. Even Xie Chongsheng, who was used to seeing the dishes of famous chefs in big restaurants, couldn't help but feel that the pursuit of ordinary life of the rich and powerful today was still lacking in refinement and elegance compared to the old aristocratic families of the past when it came to the pursuit of ordinary life. Zhang Yi, who had been thinking about Ding Ning's fortuitous encounters, was slightly distracted. When he put a piece of eggplant into his mouth and tasted the freshness of the chicken soup and shrimp juice but could not taste the eggplant, he could not help but think, eggplant was eggplant. If one wanted the freshness of the chicken and shrimp, just eat the chicken and shrimp. Why waste so much effort? Such a shallow bowl of eggplant, for ordinary Chongling farmers, would not be able to make 2 bowls of rice. But how many things would be wasted in the process of making it? One of the most important reasons why the old nobility were unable to stop the reform in the past was that they were too extravagant. The most famous story was that there was a powerful family that washed the white rice that they could not finish every day into the sewers. The monks in a nearby temple washed the white rice every day, dried it, and stored it. When the powerful family declined, the dried white rice stored in the temple was enough for a family to eat for several years. How could true nobility and loftiness be displayed with such delicacy? In his momentary daze, some true nobility and loftiness unconsciously spread from his body, matching the seal lines he had comprehended from the painting remnant scroll today. The air above Ink Garden suddenly became slightly damp. "Senior sect brother, what, do you want to soak me in the rain? You are eldest sect brother, not brother great wet." At this time, a teasing voice came from outside the door. Zhang Yi shook and refocused. He found that he had accidentally touched those lines in the world again. He instinctively withdrew his presence. The moisture in the sky disappeared. At the same time, he looked at the person who had appeared at the door and exclaimed in surprise, "Junior sect brother Ding Ning, you have returned?" Seeing Ding Ning appear at the door, Xie Chongsheng and the others immediately became excited. "Senior sect brother Ding Ning, did you comprehend something?" Shun Yi was the first to speak and asked. Ding Ning nodded. Zhang Yi was stunned. He was so surprised that he was stunned. "That's great." In the next moment, he said happily from the bottom of his heart. On this night, in a study deep in the Chongling Imperial Palace, there was a youth about their age sitting. His features were handsome, gentle and natural, and he exuded generosity and benevolence. A youth of the imperial family was sitting alone in a seclusion room. The gentleness and benevolence he exuded when he revealed his true self was even more precious. Of all of the Yuanwu Emperor's imperial sons, only one had such a personality. So he was Fu Su. At this time, there was a thin booklet open in front of him. This thin booklet was the Min Mountain Sword Trials Book of Talents compiled by the Hongyang Academy. But the Book of Talents in front of him had changed compared to the one in the daytime. On this open booklet, Chen Lufeng, who had defeated Fong Wuk, was ranked 35th. Ding Ning, who had defeated Zhou Xie, had quietly risen to 61st. In just one day, the positions of many people on the Book of Talents had changed. These changes and even the upcoming Min Mountain Sword Trials had nothing to do with Fu Su. Some of the secret cultivation manuals in the Chongling Imperial Palace would not lose to the Min Mountain Sword sect. Also, his mother, the Empress of the Qin dynasty, and his father, the Yuanwu Emperor, were the strongest cultivators in the world. They had arranged a cultivation path for him to advance on. Even if he was interested in going to Min Mountain Sword Sect to take a look with his noble status, he did not need to participate in any tests. Everything about him was something that no young genius in Chongling could envy. Yet he was very lonely, just like how he was with Ding Ning and the others right now. Many young geniuses had friends around them, but he was alone. He seemed to be alone from beginning to end, especially at the banquet at the beginning of the year, when the palace attendant who usually served him disappeared into the air as though she had never existed. Even though nothing seemed to have changed, he was smart enough to sense that everyone around him was deliberately keeping a distance from him. This kind of distance did not come from disgust and speculation, but from respect and wariness towards his parents, the Empress and the Emperor. No one was willing to cause trouble for no reason. No one was willing to turn into dust and disappear into the air. When most people who had to appear in front of him held such respect and wariness, he felt even more lonely. While the thin booklet in front of him seemed to have nothing to do with him, the changes on it made him feel lively and exciting. He wanted to have friends like normal youths and be as lively and exciting as normal youths. His gaze left the booklet, and he looked up. The square and dignified buildings outside the window looked like cold shackles. His body did not move, but his mind flew out. Perhaps I should make some changes. Otherwise, if I'm stuck in it and can't get rid of the depression, it will naturally affect the progress of my cultivation. He was talking to himself, as if he was trying to convince himself to make such a sound. A warm and sunny smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. Chapter 142. Late at night, back to the alley. Ding Ning did not return directly to the wine shop. First, he and Zhang Yi sent Shui Wangshu to the small courtyard they had rented. Xin Yi was also living in this small courtyard. While it was slightly crowded, it was lively. On the way, Shui Wangshu did not ask Ding Ning questions about cultivation. When they entered the small courtyard, Zhang Yi helped him sit down on a cushioned rattan chair. After setting up the brazier, he looked at Ding Ning and asked, "What did that old bastard of the Zhou family teach you today?" Ding Ning did not answer directly, but raised his left hand slightly. With a hiss, a black sword light charged out of the fingertip of his left hand and instantly shattered the tip of the old pear tree in the small courtyard, which shavings flew into the air. That black sword light flew far into the night sky, like a shooting star. "Flying swords!" Xin Yi instinctively exclaimed. But then he felt something was wrong. He felt a thick wave of coldness that seemed to freeze one's blood. He gaped and said, "What kind of move is this?" Shui Wangshu's expression grew grave. He hesitated for a long moment and then looked at Ding Ning and asked, "Star fiendish energy?" Ding Ning nodded. Shui Wangshu frowned slightly and then asked, "Will it be harmful?" Ding Ning said seriously, "No." Shui Wangshu was slightly suspicious and said, "That old bastard of the Zhou family is so kind." Ding Ning bent down and whispered into his ear, "The path of profit and loss." Shui Wangshu stilled and then wanted to laugh. But then he looked at Ding Ning and warned, "You still have to be careful. That old bastard of the Zhou family is at least realm 7 second class. Even at my peak, I am not a match for him." Star cold baleful Yuan Qi, Is this the legendary method of condensing baleful aura? Zhang Yi felt that Ding Ning and Shui Wangshu were speaking in riddles. He was slightly confused, but he could clearly hear the criticism in Shui Wangshu's words towards forefather Zhou. So he looked at Shui Wangshu and said hesitantly, "Cave Master, the Zhou family has been extremely polite to us today. Forefather Zhou is also kind and has taught junior sect brother Ding Ning. Is it not appropriate for us to be like this behind his back?" Regardless of whether it is appropriate or not, these words were said in this courtyard. If you heard it, then forget it. Don't mention it in front of anyone else. Shui Wangshu glanced at Zhang Yi and Shun Yi and said slowly and meaningfully, "Some things may never be recorded in the history books of the Qin dynasty, but old people like me have coincidentally seen or heard of them. Forefather Zhou and some powerful cultivators of the old prestigious families once kidnapped women and children to tempt others to save them. In the end, his stomach was cut open by a sword in an alley. He screamed and fled, his intestines flowing out. His blood dyed several streets. Everyone thought he was dead." At the time, many cultivators felt that he deserved to die like that. For cultivators, especially cultivators of Chongling, using women and children to force the enemy is a very shameless thing. I always think that everyone has a bottom line. If someone has done something like this and crossed a certain bottom line, even if they have cultivated for so many years, even if their temperament has changed, I will still feel that this person is worth being wary of. Hearing these words, Zhang Yi and Shun Yi were stunned. They could not connect that kind and amiable old man with the person Shui Wangshu spoke of. You grew up in the marketplace and have seen all kinds of people. You see people more clearly than them. In the future, even if you are the junior sect brother, you have to remind your senior sect brother Zhang Yi. Shui Wangshu looked at Ding Ning and said. He was reassured and wanted to motion for Ding Ning to go back and rest. After waving his hand, he thought of something and added, "Ding Ning, I am very satisfied with what you did today to help your senior sect brothers, junior sect brothers, and good friends. Also, tomorrow find someone to make a wheelchair for me." Zhang Yi shook and said, "Wheelchairs?" Shui Wangshu glanced at him and said, "Even with your support, it is too tiring to walk." Ding Ning knew what Shui Wangshu's words meant, but he did not show any sorrow. He nodded and said, "I will have Wang Taishu help me find a more comfortable wheelchair." Time was always the greatest enemy of cultivators. In a situation where there was no way to change it, the only thing they could do was make the limited time more exciting and glorious. As he bid farewell and left the small courtyard, Ding Ning turned and added, "Up until now, the Min Mountain Sword trials have been very successful." Shui Wangshu laughed. His laughter was so happy that his eyes narrowed into a line. "Yes," he said with relief, "just lacking some vital energy. I had not expected you to scheme for so long and learn from Zhou Rongma." When Ding Ning walked into the lightless back courtyard of the wine shop, a familiar cold voice sounded from the bedroom. Ding Ning started to wash up with hot water as usual. At the same time, he said amidst the splashing water, "I just happened to encounter the Zhou family. Also, his fiendish condensing sword can allow me to defeat most opponents in the Min Mountain Sword trials." After a slight pause, he said, "Also, I am not you. Even if I dislike someone, if that person's methods are useful to me, I will learn them. I only know that your actions and calculations are different from ordinary people." Zhang Sun Qianchua's cool voice continued to sound. "Ordinary people calculate benefits if they see the fruit, they try to pick the fruit. But you always dig deep. When you see the fruit, you even calculate the benefits of the vine and the roots of the vine. You even want to dig out the roots. Since you saw Zhou Rongma today and know he is not dead, you naturally will not leave after obtaining such methods from the Zhou family. You are right. You naturally understand me." Ding Ning sneered and said, "If he really changed his personality, I would want to spare him. But he has not changed. Also, his vital energy is stagnant. Once he feels there is hope, he will act freely. Before the Min Mountain Sword trials, he will think of ways to scheme against me. I will guide his thoughts to spirit medicines that are useful to me. If everything goes well, his plans will become my wedding dress." Zhang Sun Qianxue also sneered. The little fish schemed against the serpent. Do you not feel you have provoked too many people like this? Ding Ning suddenly laughed and said, I know this is your concern for me. Of course, I know that when fighting people like this, if I make one mistake, I will be killed. So, I will be especially careful. Zhang Sun Qianxue's voice was slightly cold. What is the use of being careful? Today, the person from Cloud Water Palace I told you about came to Falling Parasol and specially came here. I think it can only be for you. Ding Ning's movements stiffened and his brows slowly furrowed. You said you remembered the presence of the person from Cloud Water Palace? Zhang Sun Qianxue said coldly. In Chongling, when have I remembered the presence of a second person from Cloud Water Palace? Ding Ning started to dry his body and change into clean clothes. In this process, he frowned and thought. He had no clue about the matter, but in just a moment, he managed to sort it out and make a possibility. He took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. He said, the person who tried to assassinate me in Fish Market was a true madman. People like that are usually only acquainted with those in the underworld. If the person who tried to assassinate me in Fish Market was sent by Cloud Water Palace, and Cloud Water Palace is able to walk openly in Chongling right now, then the most likely possibility is that Cloud Water Palace is in cahoots with a Chongling dignitary. And this dignitary is likely to be the military dignitary who wants to deal with two-level tower. Zhang Sun Qianxue was most lazy to think about schemes and schemes. But now, Ding Ning spoke very simply. She raised an eyebrow and said to Ding Ning at the door, Liang Lian. I am not certain, but it is most likely him. Ding Ning said, I need to go out immediately. If even Cloud Water Palace wants to act personally, Wang Taishu will be in danger. Zhang Sun Qianxue said coldly, there is no need. While I do not know why Cloud Water Palace has come here, I think that only your relationship with Wang Taishu would summon such a person. So I used your name to tell his people to be careful. Ding Ning's brows immediately relaxed. Wang Taishu's power was completely different from before. He could borrow some of the military's power. If he was prepared, even if Bai Shanshui came in person, he likely would not be able to find and kill him in Chongling. Help me create a chance to act. Zhang Sun Qianxue's voice reached his ears again. His brows that had just relaxed furrowed again. Do not refuse. Zhang Sun Qianxue looked at Ding Ning and said with slight disdain, this time, it is not your matter. This is related to the Lonely Mountain Sword Horde, and I was the one who found this person. If it really is Liang Lian, and by Shanshui this way, they may discover the connection between the Nine Hell King's sword and me. Then our identities will be unavoidably drawn out. Ding Ning was silent for a moment. He could not find any other reason, and could only say this. Aren't you most skilled in scheming? Maybe in your plan, you have included me in it. Zhang Sun Qianxue looked at him and sneered. If so, then plan better. Maybe you do not need to use you and Wang Taishu as bait. You can also not let other people find traces of me and him. Even if I want to scheme against you, I want you to leave Chongling. But I cannot change you. Ding Ning looked at her in the darkness and said slowly and gravely, previously, you said that I walked too quickly, but after you could suppress the Nine Hell King's sword, you changed. You are not willing to be left out. I only hope that you will not be too fast. Zhang Sun Qianxue glanced at him and used the words he often used to answer. I will be careful. Chapter 143. It was deep into the night, but the most noble mistress of the Qin dynasty was not asleep. She was still sitting on the phoenix chair in the study. In the spirit spring not far in front of her, the white and flawless lotus flowers had already withered and were beginning to bear several equally white and flawless lotus pods that did not seem to belong to the mortal world. Fu Su wants to attend the Min Mountain Sword Trials. Hearing the report of a palace made below the spirit spring, she said softly, it's really troublesome. The palace attendant instinctively thought that the empress would not allow it. But when she looked up, she saw the faint smile on the empress' beautiful face. She stilled. He is a youth and cannot endure loneliness. But which of those true heroes has not caused trouble before? The empress said coolly, "If he wants to go, let him go. It is good to learn." The palace attendant made a sound of acknowledgement. She hesitated and said, "The Holy One has sent multiple decrees today." He confirmed that the people accompanying him to the Deer Mountain Conference are Marquis Su, Bureau Chief Huang, Prime Minister Li, and Imperial Prince Huhai. Also, the Holy One sent a decree to Feng Ho Province. He hopes that Feng Shumu will also come. But his words are gentle, and he did not force it. Prime Minister Li Huhai and Feng Shumu? The Empress murmured softly to herself. The palace attendant inexplicably felt a layer of coldness. In her view, since Fu Su was the most favored imperial son of the Empress and the Holy One, then if the Deer Mountain Conference was to bring an imperial son, it should be Prince Fu Su. Had the Holy One's attitude towards Prince Fu Su changed slightly because of what had happened at the New Year's banquet? According to some rumors in the palace, the Holy One had intended to make Fu Su the crown prince next spring. If the Holy One's mind changed, what kind of storm would there be? To her surprise, an imperceptible smile appeared at the corners of the Empress' lips again. She said softly, "This is good." The palace attendant left with misgivings. Inside and outside the imperial palace, there were many people who had the same misgivings as her. The Deer Mountain Conference was related to the conflict between the Qin dynasty, the Chu, Yan, and Qi dynasties. It was a major event. Compared to the Deer Mountain Conference that was related to the fate of the entire dynasty, the Min Mountain Sword Trials were just a game for the young in the eyes of many important people. Because it was so important, everything related to the Deer Mountain Conference would reflect a lot of information. Those who could accompany him were naturally the emperor's most trusted people. At the same time, they were also important people who held astonishing power in some aspect. Why did you summon Feng Xiumu? On a certain section of the walls of the imperial city of the Qin dynasty, two bigwigs were talking in the dark. Their faces could not be seen clearly in the dark, but one of them had a faint red glow on his face, as if cinnabar was about to seep out of his skin. His face was long and narrow, and vaguely looked like he was in his 40s or 50s. The other person seemed to be in the prime of his life. He was tall and sturdy, like an iron tower, and he was like a ferocious beast. Hot qi and blood rose from his body, causing the cold air around him to distort a little. It was as if he was stepping on an extremely hot steamer. Feng Xiumu only knows how to meditate and comprehend the sword. His Majesty naturally did not summon him because he is interesting and can relieve the boredom of the journey. Hearing the words of the bigwig with a faint red glow, the tall person said casually. The person with the faint red glow said coldly, "Has Feng Xiumu become stronger than Yi Xiling and the others after sitting for so many years?" The tall person said, "That is the only possibility." The person with the faint red glow sneered. "Feng Ho Province is glorious now, but we are not. How is it not good?" The tall person shook his head and said, "You say that His Majesty did not allow Fu Su to accompany him?" The person with the faint red glow said, "Other than this, is there anything else that is worth me coming here to talk to you?" The burly man glanced at him and said bluntly, "You've misunderstood. When His Majesty is outside, what he needs to worry about the most is His Majesty's safety. But with His Majesty's cultivation, what he needs to consider is not his safety after he leaves Chongling, but whether Chongling is stable. Who could cause Chongling to become unstable? His Majesty took Prime Minister Li away. Only Her Highness the Empress has this ability. If he has such concerns and wants to take Fu Su away, everyone knows that the Empress dotes on Fu Su. Even Fu Su stayed behind to accompany the Empress. If the Empress wants to do something, she will not have any misgivings. So His Majesty has arranged this because he absolutely trusts the Empress. The person with the faint red glow was silent for a moment and said, "You have followed His Majesty and the Empress for many years. You see more clearly than I do." The tall person glanced at him and said slowly, "So, we just have to wait. Next spring, the Prince Fu Su that the Meng family and your Duanmu family support will be the crown prince." In the morning, because most of the shops were still closed for the new year, falling parasol appeared even colder. Ding Ning cooked porridge and opened the shop. He originally wanted to ask Shui Wangxiu what he wanted to eat today, but he immediately saw a carriage waiting for two youths under the tree in front of the shop. These two youths were about the same age as Ding Ning. One was dressed in a red robe with a white fox collar, the other was dressed in a purple satin robe. The two youths had white faces and tender skin, and had proud expressions. Seeing Ding Ning, the expressions of the two youths changed. The slightly taller youth dressed in the purple satin robe immediately came forward and bowed in greeting. This one is Zhen Tingan. Greetings, Brother Ding. Ding Ning looked at this youth and returned the greeting. He asked, so early in the morning, what is the matter? Zhen Tingan smiled slightly, but his eyebrows rose. He suddenly had an arrogant expression. The ranking on the Book of Talents has changed. He looked into Ding Ning's eyes and said. Ding Ning frowned slightly and said, so what? You have risen to 61st. Zhen Tingan's smile suddenly disappeared and turned to coldness. His voice quickly turned harsh. I am now ranked 62nd. I cannot understand how you qualify to be ranked above me, so I came here early in the morning to ask you. Ding Ning said calmly, if you cannot understand, you can ask Hanyang Academy. They made the Book of Talents, not me. Zhen Tingan said mockingly, that is too troublesome for me. There are simpler and more direct methods. You want to challenge me? Ding Ning shook his head briskly and said, no. Zhen Tingan stilled and instinctively asked, why? Ding Ning glanced at him and said, not interested. Zhen Tingan laughed in anger. Is this a matter of whether you are interested or not? Ding Ning nodded and said, I do not want to waste words. You should leave. Zhen Tingan laughed loudly for a dozen breaths. It would not be good if someone tore down the door in the new year. His gaze landed on the door of the shop behind Ding Ning, and he said disdainfully, even if I pay for it, I cannot find a craftsman to make up for it. Ding Ning glanced at him and shouted, Senior Sect Brother Zhang Yi, there is a matter. Come quickly. Zhen Tingan and the youth behind him stilled. They thought, did this common youth not know the rules and wanted to call his senior sect brother to fight? A tall figure rushed out from a small courtyard not far away. Steam rose from his hand as he held a hot towel. Junior sect brother Ding Ning, what is the urgent matter? I am helping Cave Master wash up. Zhang Yi looked with a grimace at Ding Ning and asked. Ding Ning glanced at him and said, please, senior sect brother and junior sect brother Shen Yi, bring Cave Master over. There are things he likes to see. Hearing Ding Ning's words, Zhang Yi stilled. He looked at Zhen Tingan and the other youth with some understanding. Why so early? He said in a low voice and then turned to fly back. It seems that common people do not have any sense of shame. It will not work if I do not force you. Zhen Tingan smiled in satisfaction and turned to walk towards a carriage. He said, I even brought the unsharpened iron sword. I do not need to borrow it. You will not have any more excuses. Facing Zhen Tingan's arrogant attitude, Ding Ning only waited silently. After a dozen breaths, Zhang Yi and Shen Yi's figures appeared in his sight. The two carried a rattan chair and carried out Shui Wangxiu. After settling Shui Wangxiu under the nearby eaves, Zhang Yi went into the courtyard to get a thick blanket and a fire basin. Junior sect brother Shen Yi, go get a bigger umbrella. Seeing Zhang Yi put the fire basin in front of Shui Wangxiu's feet, Ding Ning said to Shen Yi, what do you need an umbrella for? Zhang Yi was slightly puzzled and looked up at the sky. At this time, the sky was clear and the morning light was shining down. Was there any hint of rain? Zhen Tingan frowned and was about to say something. But at this time, Ding Ning looked at him and said calmly, you are not a match for me. Also, my attacks are too powerful, so I will not fight you. Also, you cannot even defeat me, senior sect brother Zhang Yi. Before Zhen Tingan could speak, Ding Ning turned to look at the stunned Zhang Yi and said, senior sect brother, you fight this round. Are you making fun of me? Or do you really want me to tear down your shop? Zhen Tingan shouted in disbelief. Zhang Yi also looked at Ding Ning and said in disbelief, Junior sect brother, this, you know I speak the truth. What if I accidentally stab him to death? Ding Ning looked at him and said, also, 2 people on the genius ranking will have more face than me alone. Is this forcing a duck onto a perch? Xue Wangxiu had been slightly dazed, but now he stroked his beard and smiled. He said, but this is also good. Zhang Yi, you have a peaceful personality and need someone to push you. Do not disappoint your junior sect brother's good intentions. Zhang Yi did not dare to refute Xue Wangxiu's words. He said hesitantly, Cave Master, is this really good? Enough! Zhen Tingan shouted angrily. Ding Ning, you feel that a person who is not even in the Book of Talents is a match for me? If you do not dare, you can just crawl through my pants. Why do you have to think of so many tricks? Ding Ning's expression was slightly cold. He said scornfully, what? You do not dare? If you can really defeat my senior sect brother, I will wait for you to fight at any time. Why are you shouting here and disturbing my peace? Today, I will first defeat him and then see if you can hide. Zhen Tingan was furious. He jumped on his foot and with a hum, an unsharpened iron sword flew towards Zhang Yi. Chapter 144. Blocking the door in the morning, threatening to tear down the door, and kicking the sword to challenge, Zhen Tingan's actions today appeared very arrogant. Yet this was very normal in Chongling. Zhen Tingan was like a miniature of countless Chongling youths. Everything was false reputation. Strength was the most important. When the swordsmen of the Qin dynasty had defeated the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, Chongling had a presence where the sword was the most important. In reality, in the hearts of the nobility, the reason the Yuanwu emperor was able to succeed in his reform and control the entire Qin dynasty after ascending the throne was because he and the people around him had swords that no one else could stop. So many cultivators in Chongling respected Xue Wangxiu now, not because Xue Wangxiu was old enough, but because of his cultivation. Zhang Yi turned sideways, reached out, and accurately grabbed the hilt of the unsharpened iron sword flying at him. He was familiar with the personalities of the youths of Chongling, so he was not angry. He looked at Ding Ning and said with a frown, do you really want me to fight? Ding Ning glanced at him and said softly, fight more brilliantly. Not that I want to watch. Zhang Yi heard the meaning in Ding Ning's words. His worried expression finally disappeared, and he nodded solemnly. You made a challenge so troublesome. No wonder White Goat Cave could only belong to the Green Vine Sword Academy. Zhen Tingan had lost his patience and said rudely. Then he walked to the center of the path. He raised the unsharpened iron sword in his hand and pointed the blunt tip at Zhang Yi's chest. The blade started to tremble slightly and gave off a roar like waves hitting the shore. Zhang Yi cautiously walked forward quickly, trying to get as far away from Xue Wangxiu as possible. At the same time, he shot a look at Shen Yi, indicating for him to take care of Xue Wangxiu. If this was an ordinary time, Zhen Tingan would wait for the opponent to hold the sword before attacking. But for him, Zhang Yi was not the opponent he wanted to find. Also, Ding Ning and Zhang Yi were delaying in his eyes. So he attacked directly. The seal scripts on the unsharpened iron sword were quickly filled with blinding vital energy and primal energies of the universe. An indigo sword energy slanted forward as Zhen Tingan moved forward. This sword energy did not slash straight at Zhang Yi's chest, but splashed to the ground like a clear stream and then spread into thin indigo sword energy like bamboo leaves. Zhen Tingan was a disciple of the Clear Stream Sword School. This attack was the famed sword form of the Clear Stream Sword School, Clear Stream Bamboo Shadow. Zhang Yi hastily swung his unsharpened iron sword in front of him. A slightly curved white sword light like a curved white goat horn blocked the thin indigo sword energy that shot upwards like bamboo leaves. But at this time, Zhen Tingan had charged in front of him. A shrill cracking sound covered all the sounds of sword energy clashing. A terrifying power suddenly surged out of the tip of Zhen Tingan's unsharpened sword and stabbed towards Zhang Yi's chest. This was Clear Stream Gushing Spring. Zhang Yi sensed the terrifying momentum of this attack. His expression changed slightly, and he flicked his sword upwards. In this critical moment, his blunt sword accurately stabbed at the tip of Zhen Tingan's sword and caused the power of this attack to pass over his head. A hint of disdain flashed across Zhen Tingan's face. While Zhang Yi had easily resolved the attack, in this moment of contact, he could sense that Zhang Yi's vital energy cultivation was slightly weaker than his. Without any hesitation, the true essence in his body surged out in an even more turbulent manner, pouring into the sword and pressing down. Zhang Yi's body staggered, and he took 3 steps back. The sword light from above split into 2 and continued to advance in front of him. 2 clear and deep sword marks appeared on the stone path in front of him and sprayed out dust. There was a tearing sound. A tear appeared on Zhang Yi's right sleeve. Zhen Tingan's sword move had ended, but the disdain on his face grew. He quickly put his sword away. Once he put his sword away, a vast wave of vital energy suddenly shot out of his body and collided with the vital energy and primal energies of the universe still stored in his sword. This collision was like a blossoming wave, suddenly dragging out countless green lines of water in the air. Zhang Yi's expression grew more serious. His feet were firmly planted on the ground, and he raised the sword in his hand. With another explosion, a slightly curved white sword energy shot up. This was the white goat hanging horn of the white goat sword manual. In this moment, the blue lines of water pulled out true blue water blades and shot forward. The thickest part of the white goat horn blocked these blue water blades like a shield. Zhang Yi did not move, but his body trembled slightly. A tear appeared on each shoulder of his robes and fine beads of blood flew out. With a boom, the white goat horn disappeared. Zhang Yi took 3 more steps back. "You say you can win against me like this?" Zhen Tingan, who had taken a step back and avoided the remnant sword essence of the white goat hanging horn, pointed his sword at the ground. He looked leisurely and disdainful. Ding Ning frowned slightly. Looking at the faint marks of blood on Zhang Yi's shoulders, he said, "Senior sect brother, are you a masochist or an exhibitionist? You will wait until your clothes are torn before you truly attack?" Looking at his clothes out of the corner of his eye, Zhang Yi said in embarrassment, "I was afraid that cave master would say the time was too short and not exciting enough, and wanted to see if I could win with just the white goat sword manual. I had not expected the opponent to be so strong." Hearing the conversation between the two clearly not admitting defeat, Zhen Tingan's expression grew darker. He took a deep breath and did not want to speak. He only wanted to completely defeat Zhang Yi with his next blow. He swung his sword forward again. This time, the flow of vital energy in his body was even stronger, as though he was going to spew out all the vital energy in his energy sea at once. However, this crazy surge of true essence carried a unique rhythm. Waves of vital essence at different speeds collided and overlapped with each other on the sword in his hand. The pure black unsharpened sword in his hand started to give off blue light until it turned completely blue. Wave after wave of green flames spilled out from his sword. As his sword moved, the sword cut out wondrous paths in the air. Small whirlpools appeared in the layers of blue waves. Every tiny vortex became more and more condensed, turning into the shape of round pebbles. Zhang Yi's expression grew grave again. The Clear Stream Sword Academy had a mystic technique known as the Stream Stone Sword. The clear stream carried thousands of pebbles as it flowed forward rapidly. These thousands of pebbles were like a gigantic grindstone. Even if one could block it for a moment, they would probably be ground to death later on. Zhen Tingan must be using this stream stone sword right now. Feeling the weight of each pebble, Zhang Yi knew he had no other choice. He stabbed with the black iron sword in his hand. However, his sword did not stab forward. Instead, the tip of the sword pointed upwards, piercing towards the sky above. As he stabbed, many paths he had clearly comprehended in a garden appeared in his mind. Waves of sword chi rushed out from the tip of his sword. The clear and faint energy charged into the sky, causing moisture and rain in a garden. At this time, waves of murderous sword energy pierced the sky. What kind of change would it cause? Nothing seemed to have changed. Zhen Tingan's indigo sword light had risen and was flying over. Zhang Yi's eyes flashed with an unusual light. At the same time, his expression was slightly hesitant. Ding Ning looked at him and said calmly, "Do not be wishy-washy. Do you want Cave Master to be angry?" The moment Ding Ning spoke, Zhang Yi felt something was wrong. The sword in his hand that was stabbing towards the sky had already slashed down. At this moment, the aura in the entire alley changed abruptly. Shun Yi, who had been anticipating to the extreme, couldn't help but exclaim. Zhen Tingen's breathing suddenly stopped. He could feel countless sharp wills rapidly descending from the sky above. He unconsciously looked up. He saw countless sparkling and translucent raindrops suddenly appear in the clear sky. It was different from the rain in the past. Each raindrop in these lines of rain was connected together like countless small hammers hitting each other to spread the moisture to the ground as quickly as possible. Sensing the sharpness in the lines of rain, Zhen Tingen's face quickly paled. He let out an unprecedented roar and raised the long sword in his hand. The stream of indigo pebbles surged upwards towards the lines of rain. It was not that he wanted to block, but he could not dodge. The sword essence of Zhang Yi's sword had filled all the alleys around him. He could not reach Zhang Yi. Thousands of lines of rain fell into the alleys. Miraculously, the lines of rain that fell on the eaves on the sides, the trees in the alleys, and the other parts of the street only gave off pure moisture and splashed into water. Only where Zhang Yi's sword was pointing, where Zhen Tingan was, the lines of rain gave off terrifying energies and turned into sharp and unstoppable small swords. Countless dense raindrops pierced into the green waterfall-like stream, rushing out one straight white line after another. The sharp sword essence collided with the small pebbles in the stream and created even finer, white flowers. Each small pebble had the unshakable presence of a rock in the water, steady and persistent. Yet these lines of rain were too long and lasted longer. It was just a moment of dawn, but the stalemate was like water dripping through stone. Countless small green pebbles burst open. The stream of water that was surging upwards completely collapsed and dissipated. Zhen Tingen's unsharpened sword was still swinging powerlessly upwards, but countless raindrops had landed on his sword and his body. Zhang Yi had put away his sword, and the presence he gave off was withdrawn. Yet these raindrops had not dissipated. They hit the unsharpened sword and gave off dense clangs. Countless popping sounds came from Zhen Tingen's body. He was unable to stand under the dense impact and fell to the ground. His clothing was pierced with countless small holes, and his skin was covered in small bloody marks. The rain flowed down his skin. His tattered clothing was soaked, and his loose hair was dripping. His body started to uncontrollably tremble in cold and terror. How is this possible? What kind of sword move is this? He looked up weakly at Zhang Yi and asked with his pale lips. Chapter 145. Zhang Yi looked apologetically and awkwardly at Zhen Tingan, who was sitting dazedly in the rain. He did not know how to answer. Even he did not know the name of this move he had comprehended from the painting remnant scroll. This move is called Morning Rain Dries the Dust. Ding Ning's voice sounded. Zhen Tingan's body shook. As Ding Ning spoke calmly, he saw all the dust on the roof tiles, on the withered branches, and in the cracks of the stone paths had been washed away. Everything looked brand new. Zhang Yi nodded apologetically at Zhen Tingan again. Then he looked nervously at Ding Ning and asked, "Junior sect brother Ding Ning, how is my move?" Ding Ning glanced at him and said emotionally, "Very good." The rain falling from the sky formed lines, and the dampness formed sword essence. This was a thunderous and murderous move. If Ding Ning had been the one to use it, many things in this long alley would have been turned to dust. Zhang Yi was gentle and kind. In his hand, the murderousness of this move had been greatly restrained. As a result, the rain outside was as gentle as the spring rain. Yet, this change produced a change that even Ding Ning had not expected. The primal energies of the universe that had gathered in the sky did not tilt with the murderousness, but naturally poured in where his sword essence pointed. So while this move was still too gentle, and the sword essence could not be used to its fullest, the rain covering Zhen Tingan had increased in speed and penetration. So the same sword and sword form had different effects in different people's hands. Hearing Ding Ning's praise, Zhang Yi finally showed a relaxed smile. While Ding Ning was his junior sect brother, he seemed to have stricter demands on him than Shui Wangshu. Also, he had comprehended this sword essence after Ding Ning's reminder. At least in this move, Ding Ning was his teacher. This was the first time he had used it against an enemy, so he naturally hoped to receive his teacher's approval. Xin Yi held a large umbrella above Shui Wangshu's head. The water droplets that were splashing towards Shui Wangshu were all stopped and flowed down the umbrella. At this time, he finally realized why Ding Ning had him prepare an umbrella from the start. He had not detected that half of his clothing was wet. Looking at the spotless streets, the relaxed smile on Zhang Yi's face, and Xin Yi's half-soaked clothes to block the water droplets for him, Shui Wangshu smiled in satisfaction and said, "Very good." Zhang Yi wanted Shui Wangshu to be happy. Hearing Shui Wangshu's praise, he was truly happy, and his face seemed to glow. "You also know this sword forms?" Zhen Tingan struggled to stand up from the ground. He looked at Ding Ning with a pale face and asked. While he did not know how Zhang Yi had comprehended this move, he could sense many things from Zhang Yi's expression when he asked Ding Ning. Ding Ning glanced at him and said, "I do not cultivate this sword form, but I cultivate more powerful than this." Zhang Yi feared that Zhen Tingan would not give up and said urgently, "My junior sect brother Ding Ning speaks the truth. If you fight him, I fear you will be seriously injured. So you are not cowardly. You really have the confidence to win." Zhen Tingan's expression changed. After saying this, he turned and walked towards the carriage. But before he got on the carriage, he said softly, "But even if you have absolute confidence in defeating me, it is useless. Someone will come find you. I know someone who does not want you to have a chance to attend the Min Mountain Sword Trials." When Zhang Yi heard this, his expression suddenly changed. He asked anxiously, "Who is it?" But Zhen Tingan did not answer. The carriage carried him and the other youth and sped quickly. Only the sound of hooves echoed in the streets. He does not speak much after being defeated. This Zhen Tingan does not seem like a bored person. Zhang Yi frowned in worry. He turned to look at Ding Ning and said, "He must have heard something." Ding Ning frowned. The appearance of the Cloud Water Palace cultivator and the threat to Wang Taishu, especially Zhang Sun Qianxue's changes after suppressing the 9 Hell King sword, made him feel it was hard to control. Now that there was such a thing, his mood couldn't help but turn sour. "What? You want someone to cripple me before I attend the Min Mountain Sword Trials?" Ding Ning sneered. Regardless of whether it is Li Lingjun or other important people who want to do this for some reason, if they want to do this, they will first pay a painful price. Ding Ning's sneer caused Zhang Yi to inexplicably feel cold. Shui Wangshu looked strangely at Ding Ning. Of course, he did not know that Zhang Sun Qianxue was Ding Ning's greatest weakness. He did not know that Ding Ning was anxious because of Zhang Sun Qianxue's changes, but he was sure that Ding Ning's mood today was very different from usual. Forbearance was something Shui Wangshu was best at. So he coughed softly and prepared to reason with Ding Ning. But at this time, a voice floated from the entrance of the alley. "High cultivation, high skill. Even if you are destined to win, it is useless because in many places, human lives are worthless. Some people can easily find people and use their lives to trade for yours." The speaker was a middle-aged man in gray robes. When Zhang Yi turned his head, this gray-robed man had just come down from a gray carriage. This gray-robed man's features were ordinary, but his hair was completely shaved. There were large tattoos from the top of his head to the back of his head, but it was impossible to see what the tattoos were. He had a presence that was even colder and darker than the officials of the Divinity Bureau. He seemed to give off a musty smell, as though he had not seen the sun for a long time. Or rather, even the sun seemed to avoid his smell. Ding Ning's sneer had caused Zhang Yi to feel cold. Now, this middle-aged man of unknown origins caused Zhang Yi to feel waves of coldness and fear. This presence was distant and unfamiliar, but in a few breaths, Ding Ning thought of where this presence came from. He took a deep breath. His expression did not change much, but he started to secretly change the flow of energy in his body. He deliberately controlled his heartbeat to be faster than usual. My surname is Shui. My name is E, not E as in clothes, but one as in horizontal and vertical. The gray-robed middle-aged man had no intentions of coming back. His slightly gray eyes reflected Ding Ning's figure. He said coldly, Ding Ning, I have come here on orders from official Shun to take you to the great floating water prison to help with the case. Almost at the same time, in a dark room, Mo Qinggong, dressed in indigo robes, stood behind a gray-robed official with his hands behind his back. This gray-robed official was unusually tall and thin. Compared to the slightly fat Mo Qinggong, he was like a turret. In front of him, there was a smooth, mirror-like metal bed. On top of the bed, there were all sorts of gleaming knives. Above the mirror-like metal bed, there were some hooks, ropes, and other things hanging. Anyone who saw such a scene would immediately feel that this room was a slaughterhouse or a coroner's examination room. However, on a hook near the wall of this room, there was a body that was constantly wriggling. It was constantly emitting weak but extremely mournful moans. The sound of water came from the wall. This was a torture room. A very ordinary torture room in the great floating water prison. Looking at the figure wriggling like a maggot in the gray shadow in the corner, half of his skin stripped off, even though he had come to the great floating water prison many times, even though the Divinity Bureau had a place for torture and interrogation, Mo Qinggong was still filled with discomfort. He is already like this. Official Shun, you have spent so much effort on him. What else can he not spit out? Mo Qinggong suppressed his discomfort. Looking at the tall and thin gray-robed official, he asked in a deep voice, Why did you have official Shui find that wine shop youth to help with the case? Because I am very idle. The gray-robed official turned around. His face was thinner and longer than ordinary people, and his eyes were deeply sunken. In a dark place like this, he was not much different from a skeleton. You should know that very few people are sent here. Since the Holy One has given me a salary, of course I cannot do nothing. Since he had sent one in, he would have to spend the next few months with nothing to do on him. As long as I dig, I will be able to dig out something useful. He looked expressionlessly at Mo Qinggong and said coldly. Mo Qinggong coughed softly to ease his discomfort. Yet when the figure hanging in the corner heard the words, several months, he gave off a weak wail worse than a ghost's cry. The gray-robed official was naturally Xin Xian, who was in charge of the great floating water prison. He looked at Mo Qinggong as though he did not hear, and said, In the eyes of the Divinity Bureau, that wine shop youth is not suspicious, but in my view, he is the biggest problem. Mo Qinggong's expression turned cold. He said, What do you mean? When Bureau Chief Yi killed Zhao and I, he was present and helped Wang Taishu gain a foothold. After entering White Goat Cave, he reached profound understanding in half a day, and then his cultivation soared. 3 cultivators like this went to assassinate him, but he did not die and killed one of them in one move. This is impossible for ordinary people. The gray-robed official looked at Mo Qinggong and said expressionlessly, Too many coincidences are problematic. Too many impossibilities occurring to one person are also problematic. Do not tell me that the Divinity Bureau has investigated thoroughly, and do not tell me that Fang Shimu feels he is not suspicious. He lowered his eyes and started to show a coldness that even Mo Qinggong felt his heart tremble. When the great floating water prison handles cases, all bureaus must cooperate. You should know that I have many methods that you do not. Only when I see no problem will I feel there is no problem. Chapter 146. Ding Ning exchanged a few words with Zhang Yi and Shen Yi, and then walked onto the gray carriage that seemed to give off a musty smell. The old horses knew the way and did not need people to drive them. The 2 old horses pulled the carriage and slowly moved through the streets of Chongling. Inside the carriage, Shui Yi sat with his back facing Ding Ning. Ding Ning saw the tattoo on his green scalp. That should be Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva. He held a pearl in his left hand and a staff in his right as he sat on a lotus throne. The entire tattoo was multicolored. Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva's face was benevolent and compassionate, but this color and compassion clashed with Shui's presence and made people feel even more uncomfortable. The curtains of this carriage were not sealed. As the carriage shook, the curtains swayed, and much of the coldness seeped in. Sitting in the innermost part of the carriage, Ding Ning pulled his collar tighter. He looked at the two brown old horses through the gap created by the swaying curtains and tried to find a conversation. These two old horses are very obedient. Sitting in front of him, Shui said coldly, "The disobedient ones have been killed. After killing so many, there will be some obedient ones left behind. Animals are much easier to discipline than people. For animals, death is their greatest fear, but people are different. Some people can risk their lives to do things they think are worth it." Ding Ning's expression did not change, but he made his heart beat faster. He said, "I have never interacted with official before. I do not know why official warned me at the start." Shui did not turn around. He shook his head and said, "Do not have any illusions. I am just casually teaching you a lesson. Every young cultivator of Chongling is a valuable treasure of the Qin dynasty." Ding Ning grew silent and did not speak. Shui also did not speak and allowed the old horses to pull the carriage forward. After half a day, the carriage finally entered the outskirts of Chongling and the deathly stillness of the poplar forest. When they approached the low stone house built along the river, Shui spoke again. "When we enter the prison, you have to follow my footsteps. If you take a wrong step, you may die." Ding Ning's expression turned serious, but he still did not speak. He nodded to show that he had heard clearly. Shui sneered softly. He only showed a bit of his presence, but the two tired old horses suddenly sank into great terror and started to gallop. Moments later, they crossed hundreds of feet of flat ground and faced a stone room that did not even have a door. It looked like they were going to crash into the stone wall and die. However, in front of the fierce wind brought about by the carriage, the stone wall suddenly twisted and turned into an overlapping shadow. The wildly galloping carriage passed through the wall, suddenly plunging into a thick chill. The light on both sides quickly dimmed, and the sound of water splashing under the hooves of the horses continued. Behind this illusory stone wall formed by Yuan Qi was actually a flat passage. It was just that there were no windows on either side of the stone wall, and it was pitch black. Moreover, there was a layer of water at least 2 feet deep on the road. This was the water shadow path, the only passage into the great floating water prison. There were at least 5 kinds of powerful formations under the shallow water layer. When Ding Ning's mental power swept across, there were more than 5 kinds of murderousness under the water layer. Feeling the coldness in the unfrozen water that was even colder than ice, and thinking of the person locked in the deepest part of the water prison being in such bone-chilling water, Ding Ning stopped controlling his heartbeat and blood flow, and allowed his body to tremble slightly. With a splash, a patch of water splashed onto the ground. The carriage finally reached dry land. It was called dry land, but in reality, it was unspeakably dark and damp. There was a moldy smell coming from the cracks in the stone. After the 2 old horses set foot on the dry ground, they stopped moving, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. Someone was waiting like a ghost at the side, leading the 2 old horses away. Only Shui and Ding Ning were left on the carriage. Shui turned and looked coldly at Ding Ning. Understanding his meaning, Ding Ning walked behind him. Shui started to walk, his long gray boots leaving behind indistinct footprints on the ground. Ding Ning walked in his footprints. The great floating water prison was the most heavily guarded place in the Qin dynasty. Even someone like Mo Qinggong could only enter with the permission of the person in charge of the great floating water prison. In the imaginations of countless people, the great floating water prison was a chain of iron prisons soaked in cold water. Yet the reality was not so. At this time, in front of Shui and Ding Ning, there seemed to be an enormous valley. In the dark valley, there were many black rocks that were as huge as palaces standing tall. This kind of valley and palace-sized rocks were not illusions created by formations, but real. But these rocks all faintly gave off the murderousness of formations. Shui led Ding Ning through the thick shadows under the black rocks, passing through this seemingly peaceful underground valley. Passing through this valley, gray mist started to spread ahead. They could not see the path inside, and what it was like. It was as though there were wild beasts in the gray mist that would charge out at any time. Shui meandered through the gray mist. The path twisted upwards like he was climbing a mountain. After a few minutes, the light of some lanterns appeared in the faint gray mist. Below the lanterns was a patch of cherry blossom forest. The cherry blossoms were the kind of deep purple cherry blossoms. The cherry blossom forest was unbelievably blooming in such an underground environment where there was no sunlight at all. The dense and gorgeous purple color seemed to have seeped into the lanterns hanging in the forest. Even the flames emitted by the lanterns had turned into a faint purple color. Ding Ning's breathing paused slightly, and his brow uncontrollably furrowed. He was not faking it out of shock, but true nervousness. He had not expected that Shui would lead him through here today. And this place was truly dangerous for him. Shui stepped into the purple cherry blossom forest. Ding Ning stepped on his footprints. With this step, all the petals on the surrounding cherry blossom trees left their branches and danced around him and Shui. This was a stunning scene that could not be described with words. Countless petals danced in the air, giving off bright light. Yet for Ding Ning, this beautiful scene contained countless dangerous lines. Just like Zhang Yi and the others in front of the painting remnant scroll, if his mind unconsciously followed any line, these dancing purple cherry blossom petals would naturally give off special presences. Right now, as he walked through the rain of flowers, he couldn't help but look. However, these lines were extremely familiar to him. He had to look at these lines and not touch them at all, as if he couldn't see or sense them. Even for him, this was extremely difficult. When his mind was slowly pulled, and he felt terror rise in his heart, and sweat was about to bead on his back, Zhang Sun Qianxue's face appeared in Ding Ning's mind. I want to safely pass through here. I cannot let her stay in Chongling alone. I must pass through here. These 3 sentences sounded in Ding Ning's mind. Then, just like when he was cultivating at night, a heavy snowstorm swept through his heart. His state of mind became absolutely cold and calm once again. Blood One walked at the front. When he stepped out of the cherry blossom forest, all the purple petals in the air flew back to the branches like butterflies. The purple wild cherry blossom forest looked as bright as before and had not changed at all. Ding Ning looked back. Looking at this patch of wild cherry blossom forest, he said coldly inside, Zhang Sun Qianxue is my greatest weakness, but she is also my greatest meaning in Chongling. Blood One continued to move forward. They passed through a stone path that seemed to be 2 abysses on both sides, and finally stopped in front of a grave-like stone room. He turned to Ding Ning and said coolly, "We are here." After saying this, Blood One silently retreated, leaving only Ding Ning standing in front of the stone room. Ding Ning carefully controlled the flow of energy in his body so that his heartbeat sped up.
Come in.
A voice that seemed to come from a high place came from the stone room in front of him. Because it was too high, it was too cold. Ding Ning seemed to hesitate and did not dare to move. Come in. Since official Shen has allowed you to come in, there will naturally be no danger here, a voice that Ding Ning was familiar with said. Ding Ning's eyes lit up slightly. Official Mo, then, he did not hesitate and quickly walked into the stone room in front of him. The tall and thin Xin Xian looked coldly at Ding Ning, who walked in from the door.
Sit.
He pointed at an iron chair in front of him and motioned for Ding Ning to sit. Ding Ning glanced at Mo Qinggong next to him. Without a word, he sat down on the cold iron chair. Xin Xian reached out. He was too tall and thin. His hands were much longer than ordinary people. So when he reached out, his hand landed on Ding Ning's head. Ding Ning could not avoid it even if he saw it. His fingers tightened slightly. His power penetrated between the flesh and bones of Ding Ning's head and then relaxed. A hint of undisguised regret and melancholy flashed through his brow. In the history of the Yuanwu Emperor's ascension, he had been one of the people who had been decisive. Later on, he had taken charge of the great floating water prison. In the eyes of most of the Chongling nobility, he had either caused the Yuanwu Emperor's displeasure in some matters, or the Yuanwu Emperor did not like to use people who had betrayed others. Yet only he knew that he had not come to the great floating water prison because of demotion, but because of his own request. Because this was related to his cultivation. Where else in the world would there be as many powerful cultivators as the great floating water prison? Where would there be so many living cultivators' bodies for him to dissect and study? What's more, these people would spit out a lot of cultivation methods and experiences. So this great floating water reservoir was an enormous treasure trove. Because he had chosen this path, in the first year of Yuanwu, his cultivation had not been as strong as Yi Siling or the marquises of Chongling. But now he was stronger than many of them. Everything was false. Only strength mattered. Strength was status. Compared to vital energy and presence, a cultivator's flesh, blood, and bones could not be faked. With just a touch, he would be able to sense the strength of the other party's flesh and blood, as well as the degree of old and noob of the bones. Bone age was the true age. When he had noticed Ding Ning's existence and thought of the wineshop youth's astounding rise, he had an astounding thought, or even hope. If this wineshop youth was that person's heir, then his cultivation speed, comprehension, and fighting ability were all normal. If this was the case, if he could get something from this wineshop youth, then his strength and status in Chongling would be even greater. But to his regret and disappointment, this youth did not have any problems today. All of these reactions, even if it was true age, were absolutely impossible. Because this wineshop youth should have been born 3 years after that person's death. How could he have any connection to that person? He could not have received that person's personal inheritance and some of that person's experiences. Because he was too regretful and disappointed, his mood was bleak. Chapter 147. After the melancholy was self-disdain. Shen Xian thought. He had thought too much. How could there be such a good thing in the world? Just a thought from him, and he happened to run into it. It seems your investigation is not a problem. Tall and thin, he bowed his head slightly and expressed his apology to Mo Qinggong next to him. Mo Qinggong naturally did not think he had the ability to be on equal footing with him. He bowed in return and said, "Official Shun is too polite." Seeing Shun Xian's expression change, Ding Ning knew his greatest danger had passed. Yet at the same time, he decided to tell Zhongsun Qianxue everything that had happened in the great floating water prison today. He wanted her to know that their enemy, a truly powerful enemy like Shen Xian, still maintained great wariness even 12 years after the Yuanwu Emperor ascended the throne. When something worthy of their attention happened in Chongling, they would subconsciously think of that person. Shen Xian turned his head and indicated for Ding Ning to stand. At the same time, he said slowly, "The resolve of cultivators is much stronger than ordinary people, especially many powerful cultivators. They can even lie to themselves and separate their senses from their bodies. At that time, their bodies are like an unrelated bag of skin to them. No matter what you do to their bodies, it is like they are torturing someone else. So in order to completely destroy their resolve, you have to start from their mental level. I have interrogated the cultivator who tried to assassinate you, but I fear there are some things I missed. This cultivator entered the great floating water prison because of you. When he sees you, his emotions will become even more unstable. I have something to do." Ding Ning stood up and nodded to indicate he understood. Shen Xian turned and walked towards the wriggling figure on the iron hook behind him. A faint wave of energy came out of his body and entered the meridians of that figure with some fresh power. Ding Ning carefully controlled his heartbeat and murderousness as he looked at the cultivator who had tried to assassinate him in Fish Market. At this time, this cultivator had turned into a terrifying piece of red meat, but half of his face was purposely left intact. it was still possible to see his previous appearance. When that wave of vitality entered, this cultivator suddenly released an extremely unpleasant sound of breathing, as if someone who had been drowning for a long time finally breathed in a breath of fresh air. His one undamaged eye finally produced some light, reflecting the three people in front of him. Yet when he saw Ding Ning and Xin Xian's faces, this cultivator's eyeball turned blood red. His eyeball was wide, covered in veins as though it would explode. It was a look of terror, shock, regret, and many other emotions that could not be described with words. Before Sun Xian could speak, this cultivator started to recite, "I am Zhuang Yonglai." Originally from Jiaodong, another wave of energy came out of Xin Xian's body and entered the cultivator's body. The cultivator instantly became motionless. It was as if even his emotions were frozen at this moment. "You can leave." Sun Xian waved his hand at Ding Ning, indicating that Ding Ning could leave. Walking out of this stone room, Ding Ning saw Shuawen was already waiting outside. At this time, Ding Ning felt a wave of sorrow, his eyes slightly dry. He knew that the deepest stone room was not far from here. He even knew the location of that stone room. However, the saddest thing was that he couldn't even look in that direction, couldn't even carefully sense what kind of arrangements there were. He couldn't even let the bitterness in his eyes show in the slightest. He could only think, at least, as he had wished from the start. He finally entered this great floating water prison that had changed greatly. Following Shuawen's footsteps, he thought coldly inside. In a situation where so many powerful formations had been perfectly preserved, there seemed to be only one way to quickly enter the innermost water prison. After entering the water prison, there seemed to be only one possibility to leave, for cultivators above Realm 7 had to work together. Thinking of the presence flowing out of Sun Xian's body, his gaze grew colder. He was certain that 4 was not enough. At least 5 Realm 7 cultivators were needed. But in all of Chongling, who would dare to enter here and defy the cultivators of the Qin dynasty? Ding Ning felt slightly cold. He shrunk his body slightly. Many of the flowers painted on the wall of the Wutong building had dimmed due to time. Many cultivators above Realm 7 were involved in this wall. But just like Liang Lian and Forefather Zhou, who he had just added, these people could kill each other in his plan, but how could they work together for him? Zhang Sun Qianxue was in front of the wall he had painted. She did not understand the meaning of Ding Ning's flower-like symbols. She was not willing to spend any brain power on matters other than cultivation. She only wanted to turn herself into a sword that would forget many things. It would become simpler and simpler, but also stronger and stronger. So while this wall had existed for a long time, this was the first time she stood here and looked seriously. Today, she had such a change because she had heard what Shuawen had said to Ding Ning. She knew what kind of place the great floating water prison was. Entering a place like that, Ding Ning was likely to be trapped. She couldn't help but feel a little anxious. At this time, it was the first time that she truly saw the painting wall that Ding Ning had left behind. At first, she felt that it was extremely complicated, and it was extremely difficult for her to firmly remember so many grudges. But soon, her picturesque brows furrowed deeply, and an indescribable strange feeling rose in her heart. She could faintly see that the paths between the flowers were the paths of Chongling. One of the blue flowers was the location of the wine shop she was in right now. Some of the gray flowers were in the turrets that kept watch on the straight paths of Chongling. These positions were fixed, and there were many seemingly random and meaningless green leaves. In her eyes, they became the stationed and active tiger wolf army. Some of the intentionally empty places were best to avoid the turrets and the routes of the tiger wolf army. So this wall was also a map of how to escape Chongling as quickly as possible. Ding Ning had so easily drawn such a map, with some hints. He definitely knew it by heart, so this map was for her to see. What made it even more difficult for her to understand was that all the pictures on the wall were actually a person's face. It was her face. While other than her, no one would be able to see it, but they had the same charm. But just like practicing the sword, it was not hard to refine the form, but the charm was hard. If there is no definite news of you before midnight, I will try to leave. Zhang Sun Qianxue took a deep breath and spoke coldly to the wall like she usually spoke to Ding Ning. However, at this moment, her beautiful face was suddenly covered with a layer of frost. She sensed a familiar aura. A carriage stopped outside a restaurant along the street. A carriage driver in thick cotton robes dozed off as he held a slightly hot copper soup. He was waiting for his employer in the restaurant. A light wind blew behind his head. This carriage driver felt his eyelids grow heavy. His head drooped, and he fell into a deep sleep. A gentle power came from the empty carriage behind him. It controlled the reins, turned the horse around, and slowly moved towards an alley outside Falling Parasol. This carriage silently followed a man dressed as a merchant passing through Falling Parasol. After following the carriage through several streets and alleys, the carriage lost control and stopped. The coachman, who was sleeping soundly, suddenly woke up. When he saw the surrounding scenery, he was sweating profusely. He repeatedly scolded himself for being too sleepy and causing the carriage to wander around several streets. Fortunately, he didn't bump into anyone. At this time, the carriage driver of the other carriage on the street also had his head drooped and fell into a deep sleep. At the same time, a gentle power came from the carriage and continued to control the carriage to follow the man. After passing through several more streets, the man dressed as a merchant stopped in his tracks. The restaurant in front of him had its doors closed. Yet Zhang Sun Qianxue, who was slowly releasing a gentle power from the carriage, sensed a gray-robed man washing some horse gear in the back courtyard of the restaurant. She knew that this gray-robed man was called Jing Mazong. He was one of Wang Taishu's most loyal subordinates, and someone who had fought with Ding Ning in the streets. At this time, she sensed the intentions of the man dressed as a merchant who gave off a familiar presence. After a moment of thought, she said coldly and softly as though she was speaking to Ding Ning, "Apologies, the plan does not change." In the next moment, her presence shook slightly. The primordial qi controlling the reins became even more violent. The man standing in front of the restaurant suddenly turned around, and his gaze landed on the carriage she was in. Zhang Sun Qianxue's expression did not change. She controlled the carriage to continue forward. The man dressed like a merchant narrowed his eyes slightly. He gave off an indescribable coldness and rebelliousness. A slight scornful smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. Without any hesitation, he quickened his steps and followed Zhang Sun Qianxue's carriage. Chapter 148. The carriage passed through the streets of Chongling. The lines on Ding Ning's wall were of some use. This carriage quickly passed through the busy city and headed towards a farmhouse on the shore of a tributary of the Wei River. When the carriage driver passed through the streets, he was pushed by a gentle force to land under a wall illuminated by sunlight. He looked like an idler sitting under the wall and taking a nap. Looking at the leisurely speed of the carriage, the peddler who had been following behind the carriage all this time had a sneer on his face that became more and more intense. His eyes also began to emit a peerlessly domineering, unruly, and fierce aura that was hard to describe. Only a few great rebels in the world could possess such an indescribable presence of looking down on a country and dynasty. This peddler-like man was naturally one of the direct disciples of Cloudwater Palace, Fanjue, and Bai Shanshui's right-hand man. At this time, Fanjue could see that this carriage was purposefully leading him here. But in his eyes, the person in the carriage was just seeking death. The number of people in Chongling who could kill him was limited, but people like that would not exist in Two-Level Tower. Even the cultivators that Two-Level Tower invited outside would not think that he was from Cloudwater Palace. But these were just his personal thoughts. Zhang Sun Qianxue's thoughts were usually simple, but this did not mean that she was stupid. When the carriage drove into an uninhabited slum that should have been left behind by the duck farmers, she was certain that this place would not be seen by the nearest turret. She thought again about the lines on Ding Ning's wall. After thinking about the path she would take to leave, she slowly stopped the carriage between a patch of crude huts. Fanjua followed the tracks of the carriage into this temporary village. Looking at the greenish-yellow or white duck dung exposed under the cracked ice, his brow furrowed and he said mockingly, "The location is not bad, but the environment is too bad." Inside the carriage, Zhang Sun Qianxue also frowned deeply. She had always had a serious obsession with cleanliness. Although this was the safest place she had chosen, she still felt extremely uncomfortable when she heard Fanjua's words. She decided to leave this place as soon as possible. "Why do you want to kill Wang Taishu? Is it because of Liang Lian?" she asked in an unusually straightforward manner. "You are from the warden's office?" Fanj was stilled. He had not expected the person in the carriage to be a woman, nor had he expected the other to say such words. But when he thought about how the warden's office did not have a powerful female cultivator like Yi Xiling, he did not feel much wariness. Zhang Sun Qianxue shook her head and said unhappily, "I'm the one asking you a question, not the other way around." She was born in the number 1 old aristocratic family, and her temperament was extremely cold. Now that she was unhappy, her voice naturally carried a kind of biting coldness and a high and mighty coercion. Fanj was sneered. His unruly aura burst out, and his body seemed to grow taller all of a sudden. "Are you Yi Xiling? You dare to speak to me in such a tone?" He looked disdainfully at the carriage and said, "I fear that if you know my identity, you will immediately get off the carriage and kneel in front of me, begging me not to kill you. Cloudwater Palace is just a declining sect. You can roam the mountains and call yourself king, but in Chongling, you have to know how to tuck your tail between your legs." Zhang Sun Qianxue was from the Qin and a former noble. She looked down on foreign cultivators, especially those whose countries had been destroyed. She sneered and said impatiently, "Since you are wary of Yi Xiling, then you should answer my question. Otherwise, I will kill you directly." Fanj suddenly put away his cold smile. A feeling of danger spread through his body. Since she knew his identity from Cloudwater Palace, she dared to deliberately lure him here. Also, he could hear the other's meaning in her words. She did not even care about Yi Xiling. In all of Chongling, among all the female cultivators, who was stronger than Yi Xiling? Thinking about the noble and insufferably arrogant aura this woman had been emitting ever since she spoke, Fanj suddenly thought of a possibility. His pupils contracted in disbelief. "Could it be that you are Zheng Xiu?" Zheng Xiu was the noblest mistress of the Qin dynasty, the empress of the Qin dynasty. At the same time, she was the strongest cultivator of the Zheng family. Hearing his exclamation, Zhang Sun Qianxue's expression changed. She shouted coldly, "Who is this bitch?" Fanjua immediately found this absurd. "Bitch?" The other called Empress Zheng Xiu a bitch? And she seemed to be so righteous. As he found this absurd and incomprehensible, he felt an even stronger sense of danger. A fine layer of sweat formed on his back.
"Who are you?"
He took a deep breath, his expression becoming solemn. He stared at the carriage, his brows filled with viciousness. When have you ever heard of Cloudwater Palace's people being forced by the enemy to say what they want to know? In the carriage, Zhang Sun Qianxue's frown deepened. She started to feel that she was just as Ding Ning had said, not skilled in matters outside of cultivation. But she had always done things simply. "I originally did not want to kill you, but I coincidentally encountered you. I also do not want you to kill that person from 2-level tower. Since this is the case, I will kill you," she said. "You have a great tone." Fanj sneered. His voice was as loud as thunder. At the same time, thunder seemed to roar around him. A sword like flowing water appeared in his hand. At the same time, a patch of white cloud suddenly fell from the sky above. In the air, this patch of white cloud had completely turned into water, becoming a glowing and vast stream of water like a serpent. Fanjua's sword turned into a stream of water and slashed towards the carriage. The dragon-like stream of water in the sky also fell towards the carriage. At the same time, his body seemed to be pulled by the sword and flew towards the frozen river. His body was wrapped in thick water vapor. There seemed to be 3 streams of water dancing in the air. Fanjua's face was vicious, but his eyes were cold and calm. While his cultivation was Realm 6 first class, and he was still a step away from Realm 7, Cloud Water Palace's cultivation methods and fighting methods were not something ordinary cultivation sects could compare to. Also, the closer they were to water, the stronger the cultivators of Cloud Water Palace would be. While this river was frozen, he had a way to turn it into flowing water. Even if the other was a cultivator who surpassed Yi's ceiling, he was confident he could use this river to escape. Before the water arrived, a powerful force tore apart the carriage and sent the 2 large horses pulling the carriage flying. Zhang Sun Qianxue was among the fragments of the carriage. Her body seemed to be cut by the fragments. Yet, in the eyes of a cultivator of her level, the scene seemed to have stopped. A blue long sword appeared in her hand. The color of the long sword darkened rapidly, turning into a bluish-black color, forming a strong contrast with her jade-white skin. The bluish-black color was too deep, so when she held the sword, it was as if she was holding the world of the netherworld. In this moment, Fanjua, who was flying towards the frozen river, saw her face and the sword in her hand. Nine Hell King's sword, you are Gong's son, he finally reacted and cried out in shock. At this time, Zhang Sun Qianxue attacked. All of the fragments of the carriage around her suddenly stopped in the air, turning into countless crystals wrapped in blue ice. Then, in the next moment, they exploded into dust. The vast and enormous flow of water falling from the sky quickly froze when it was dozens of feet away from her, turning into blue crystals from head to tail. It stopped in the air and then crashed to the ground. Fanjua's life-bond sword gave off a shrill hum, but it could not stop the blue ice crystals from spreading on its surface. It was completely frozen when it was a few feet away from her and was sent flying by Zhang Sun Qianxue's power. Fanjua's vital energy surged out of his body like a great river and crashed below him. At this time, he was on the frozen river surface. His true essence was like countless waterfalls crashing onto the ice surface, causing a strange rhythm. The entire frozen river immediately thawed. The cold air was forcibly forced out of the water, forming countless threads of light that flew high into the sky and dispersed like fireworks. Boom, 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 boom. A string of terrifying explosions sounded around him. Enormous pillars of water shot up around him and formed multiple walls of water with him at the center. However, the river water beneath him did not dry up. It was as if the water in the distance had been attracted over in an instant. Instead, it formed a huge water whirlpool beneath him. His body was about to fall into it and use the water to escape. Crack, 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 crack. But at this time, Fanjua's breathing stopped. He seemed to hear the sound of death. Countless huge water pillars changed color, all of them turning into azure ice pillars. A blue-black sword light pierced through the center of one of the ice pillars and stabbed in front of him. Fanjua's face was bloodless. He screamed and used the fingers of his right hand as a sword. A terrifying sword essence stabbed out of his fingers in an attempt to fight for a sliver of time. But his right hand immediately lost all feeling and broke. A loud smack was heard. His body shot backwards and embedded into the ice pillar behind him. Such a powerful 9 Hell King sword. I had not expected you to have such terrifying cultivation. But you cannot get anything from me. Bai Shanshui will take revenge for me. Fanjua's vital energy could not flow, but his face was covered in a vicious smile. When this voice sounded, a unique flow of water seemed to rush from his abdomen to the top of his head.
Pew.
A white stream of water gushed out of his mouth. This great rebel of Cloud Water Palace stopped breathing just like that. There was no more life in him. Chapter 149. The blue-black sword light disappeared. Zhang Sun Qianxue's figure appeared in front of Fanjua. Looking at Fanjua, whose vital energy had been completely frozen, but who had still used an unknown secret art of Cloud Water Palace to kill himself, Zhang Sun Qianxue did not have any pride on her face, but a hint of confusion and sadness. In the end, He was an enemy of the Yuanwu Emperor. Now, there was one less. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out her hand and released a few strands of aura to search Fanjua's body. She took out everything in Fanjua's clothes and put them into her sleeves, without looking at them carefully. In the next moment, countless invisible but real paths seemed to appear in the world around her. Waves of icy energy were drawn out along these paths and quickly dissipated into the world. All the blue colors disappeared. The icicles collapsed and fell to the ground. Zhang Sun Qianxue's brow furrowed deeply again. She knew that the distant turrets had sensed the abnormality here, and there should be cultivators hurrying over. But she was not skilled in many things, such as destroying corpses. She thought for a long time, and then made a decision. A vast wave of primal energies of the universe came out of her body and turned the shattered ice piled up in the surroundings into fine ice powder. The wild wind spun on the river surface and filled all the holes with the ice powder. Her body landed in the center of the shattered carriage. The vital energy in her body should have been extremely cold, but as her face turned slightly red, she forcibly turned it into an incomparably hot flow. In the next moment, the burning vital energy gushed out with her body as the center and immediately ignited countless fire snakes. The fire serpents ignited all the shacks, and a large number of fire serpents coiled around Fanjua's body, burning him to ashes in an instant. Then, they were blown away by the strong wind, drifting to an unknown place. Zhang Sun Qianxue's body also disappeared under the cover of the raging flames. A few dozen breaths later, several black-robed cultivators arrived at the scene of the fire. When they sensed the remaining vibrating rhythms in the air, the expressions of these cultivators changed. The leading cultivator raised his hand, and a black pillar of smoke rushed into the sky. Chongling was enormous. While Falling Parasol to the Great Floating Water Prison was not far on the map of Chongling, even on the shortest route, a familiar carriage would need more than half a day to travel. They had spent some time in the Great Floating Water Prison, so by the time they returned to Falling Parasol, the sky was already dark. Ding Ning closed his eyes as if he was tired, but in fact, he was thinking about all kinds of possibilities. At this time, the temporary village formed by the duck farmers on the bank of the Wei River's tributary had long disappeared and turned into a piece of scorched earth. Several dozen black-clothed officials of the Astrology Bureau stood like nails, surrounding this area. All of a sudden, a strange light flashed in the eyes of the dozens of black-clothed officials with solemn expressions. Several carriages entered their line of sight. They drove along the dirt path between the crisscrossing paths and stopped outside the forest. Even though there was no wind or rain, the 5 people who walked down from the carriages still opened their black umbrellas and covered their faces. A white-robed woman and an old man who looked like an old servant walked over surrounded by these 5 black umbrellas. The white-robed woman was naturally the bureau chief of the Astrology Bureau, Yi Sealing. The old man who looked like an old servant next to her was the legendary strongest of the 6 academicians of the Astrology Bureau, Han Sancher. The other 5 symbolic black umbrellas naturally represented the other 5 mysterious academicians of the Astrology Bureau. Yi Sealing made a gesture from a distance. The dozens of Astrology Bureau officials who had sealed off this area immediately flashed out and distanced themselves from the sealed and monitored area. Yi Sealing and Han Sancher slowly walked through the scorched earth. In the end, they stood where Zhang Sun Qianxue's carriage had been destroyed. The 5 black umbrellas spread out and carefully sensed the presence left behind, searching every inch of the ground. This process continued for a long time. When the sky was completely dark, the academicians of the Astrology Bureau under the 5 black umbrellas finally exchanged opinions with Han Sancher. During this time, Yi Sealing only calmly looked at the traces left by the fire and did not even listen to their conversation. Only when Han Sancher walked to her side did she look at him and say, "How is it?" Han Sancher said softly, "It is her." Yi Sealing then asked, "The opponent is from Cloudwater Palace?" Han Sancher nodded slightly and said, "Should be." Yi Sealing grew silent. Han Sancher also grew silent. Remove all traces we can detect. Yi Sealing's face started to fade into the darkness. His emotions could not be seen. His tone was low but unusually firm. Do not record it. Do not inform the other bureaus. Hans Sancher was the oldest academician of the Astrology Bureau and the only person Yi Sealing had brought overseas. He naturally knew the meaning of Yi Sealing's words better than anyone else. His hands were slightly cold as he asked softly, "Even Chief Inspector Chen does not know?" Yi Sealing nodded and said, "No." In the darkness, Ding Ning walked back to the wine shop. Before this, he had already gone to Shui Wangxiu's little courtyard and talked to Shui Wangxiu, Zhang Yi, and Shen Yi about the great floating water prison. The moment he entered the wine shop and closed the door, Zhang Sun Qianxue's cold voice sounded in the darkness. "You are right. I am not skilled in many things." Ding Ning, who was very familiar with Zhang Sun Qianxue, immediately stopped breathing and asked, "What happened?" Zhang Sun Qianxue slowly said, "I killed that Cloud Water Palace cultivator. That person was very strong and should be Fanjua." Hearing the word kill, Ding Ning's body quickly turned cold. When he heard the complete sentence, he thought of how he had been considering if he could work together with Bai Shanshui to break the great floating water prison. He was so angry his body trembled. "Since you agreed to wait, why did you not wait?" Zhang Sun Qianxue was strangely not angry. She explained, "It is not that I do not have patience, but he wanted to kill Wang Taishu's subordinate. I did not want him to kill Wang Taishu's subordinate." Hearing this explanation, Ding Ning's anger quickly faded, but the coldness still caused him to tremble slightly. He took a deep breath and walked in front of Zhang Sun Qianxue. He asked, "What did you do after you killed Fanjua?" Zhang Sun Qianxue did not want to think of the scene back then. She said with a frown, "I did my best to remove the presence of the 9 Hell King sword and used the methods of the Zhao True Fire Palace to burn his corpse and the things around him." Ding Ning was silent for a moment and said, "What were your thoughts back then?" Zhang Sun Qianxue said, "Even if I could not completely conceal my presence, I could at least not let others detect who I killed." "Your thoughts are correct." Ding Ning calmed down and said slowly, "But Fanjua is not an ordinary cultivator. If you want to kill him, you have to show power close to Realm 7 second class. This kind of power cannot be completely removed. The Astrology Bureau and the Divinity Bureau can find it." Zhang Sun Qianxue bowed her head slightly and said coldly, "So, I admit that I am not skilled in many things." Ding Ning was silent for a moment and said, "This matter cannot be blamed on you. Maybe we can use this matter to see a person's true attitude." Zhang Sun Qianxue asked in confusion, "Who?" Ding Ning looked at her and said, "Yi Sealing." Zhang Sun Qianxue's voice immediately turned cold. She said, "You think too much." Ding Ning did not argue. He shook his head and smiled bitterly. If he really thought too much, if Yi Sealing used Bai Shanshui's power and used Bai Shanshui's revenge, then he would not have waited until the Min Mountain Sword trial started. A person like Bai Shanshui viewed life as ants and would not have any misgivings. Who could hide a secret in front of such a person's mad killing? If he could not wait until the Min Mountain Sword trials, even if he could enter Chongling again, would he have the chance to enter Min Mountain Sword sect and obtain the heaven-replenishing divine art? Thinking of Shui Taishu, Ding Ning's expression grew even more bitter. In the thick darkness, the scorched riverside was like a ghost hell. On the surface of the frozen river, a stream of water suddenly gushed out without any sound. Bai Shanshui, who was wearing a white fox fur coat and had skin as fair as cream, rose from the center of the water flow. He was as handsome as a young master from a wealthy family, but his body exuded an indescribable arrogance. This great rebel of Cloud Water Palace, an existence that caused countless people in the world to tremble at the mention of his name. While he could clearly sense that there were still cultivators from the Qin dynasty in the distant forest, he did not care. He only needed a moment. A translucent teardrop fell from his eye and landed on the ice, but it disappeared without a sound. Numerous white water droplets slowly seeped out of the ice under his feet. Seeing these white water droplets, he was certain that the battle here had been caused by Fanjua, and that Fanjua had been killed. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. In the darkness, countless tiny droplets of water seeped out of the charred ashes and flew up. In his perception, there was a fire rising from the ground. A black bamboo had grown and swayed in the night mist. Chapter 150. In the tent at the center of the Tiger and Wolf Army camp, the light was dim, and only one oil lamp was lit. On the bed covered in ordinary blankets, Liang Lian sat with a wooden expression. Multiple strands of condensed primal energies of the universe floated around him like shields and gravestones. Suddenly, he sensed something. He opened his eyes and looked out of the tent. His gaze was cold and filled with wariness. Even for him, at this moment, he could feel a killing intent that caused his entire body to turn ice-cold as it pierced through the air. With a whoosh, the tent flap was blown open by thick water vapor. Bai Shanshui, dressed in white fox fur robes, appeared in the tent. The water vapor extinguished the oil lamp. Liang Lian's eyebrows rose slightly. Bai Shanshui looked calmly at him and said, "Help me search for Realm's 7 cultivators skilled in energy and ghosts." In the bedroom in the backyard of the Falling Parasol wine shop, an oil lamp was lit. Ding Ning spread out all the things that Zhongsun Qianxue had found on Fanjua's body on his bed. At this time, he had recovered his calm. For people like Fanjua, there was only the possibility of making a transaction. There was no possibility of extracting any useful information from their mouths. For Zhongsun Qianxue, who had been more pampered than a princess since childhood, and then left home to cultivate, and did not know much about the ways of the world, today's performance was very good. For him, there were countless possibilities in life. If he could not enter Min Mountain Sword Sect, he had 2 choices. The 9 death silkworms cultivation dissipated, or he could find a solution from the lonely mountain sword horde. Fanjua had many things on him. Many of them were things that normal people would use. Clearly, he felt that he had no chance of dying. Ding Ning did not even let go of the most ordinary things like silver. He looked carefully before dismissing them. In the end, there were only 3 things left in front of him: a pearl, a yellowed sheepskin scroll, and a wooden tablet. The pearl was about the size of a longan fruit. It emitted a gentle glow in the dark night, as if there were waves of dense mist on its surface. However, the most peculiar thing was that this pearl was translucent. Its interior was as blue as the sea, and the light within seemed to faintly form some images. Ding Ning narrowed his eyes slightly. He saw that the image inside the pearl seemed to be a celestial island with countless beautiful palaces and spirit springs and spirit medicines. What is this? In the previous process, Zhongsun Qianxue had been waiting patiently. She finally asked, "This is a sea serpent pearl, a pearl formed from an enormous shellfish overseas." Ding Ning said, "Ever since the Qin dynasty opened up the sea route, they have found 3 such sea serpent pearls. These sea serpent pearls are called sea maps of the celestial realms in the overseas countries. Legend has it that the map formed inside is the place with the most abundant spirit energy of all the seas it has visited. In the 3rd year of Yuanwu, the armored fleet of the Qin dynasty used the sea map in a sea serpent pearl to find Donglai Island and obtained large amounts of spirit medicines for cultivation." Zhongsun Qianxue frowned slightly. She said, "So this is the legendary sea serpent pearl. I remember that my family used to have one. But the legends cannot be completely believed. The sea map within is ethereal and illusory. Of all these sea serpent pearls, only 1 in 10 has been proven to exist in the sea map." Ding Ning said in a deep voice, "When the Wei dynasty was at its peak, they once wanted to open up the sea. The Cloud Water Palace mainly cultivated the water element method and was at the forefront. But after the Wei dynasty was destroyed, there were only a few people left in the Cloud Water Palace. But if these people wanted to go overseas, it would be an indefinite period of time. Zhang Sun Qianxue nodded. This sea serpent pearl most likely had been left behind by the Cloudwater Palace at that time. But the present Cloudwater Palace did not have the power to go overseas and search for the ethereal islands that might not even exist. Ding Ning put the sea serpent pearl to the side and opened the yellowed sheepskin scroll. With just a glance, his gaze flickered violently. Water record scripture? Zhang Sun Qianxue asked in puzzlement. Why is he carrying this on him? This Chongling water record scripture was not a cultivation record, but a water record created by a doctor surnamed Yin of the previous dynasty. It recorded the flow of the underground water around Chongling and Guangzhou. It was also called the Yin record scripture. This water record had been of great use back then. But later, the terrain changed, and the Qin dynasty built many open and hidden canals for irrigation. On the basis of this water record, the Qin dynasty had a more complete water record. This sheepskin scroll was extremely old and should be from the previous dynasty. It was hard to understand why someone would carry such an ancient and unsuitable water record. Also, Zhang Sun Qianxue could see that Ding Ning's expression was very unusual. It seems that the rumors are true. Cloudwater Palace does have the remains of the lonely mountain sword hoard. Ding Ning took a deep breath and looked at her beautiful eyes. He said, also, they know how to comprehend the lonely mountain sword hoard from the remains. Zhang Sun Qianxue frowned.
Why?
Ding Ning said, the people of the world only know that the lonely mountain sword hoard has a treasure map left behind, but they do not know that the so-called treasure map contains secrets. It uses the flow of primal energies of the universe to indicate certain directions. The flow of some mines and underground rivers can help cultivators understand the flow of primal energies of the universe. Now, many of the landforms have changed. If one wants to understand the true flow of underground rivers, they have to use the previous water record scripture. If so, this means that Bai Shanshui at least knows the way to solve the lonely mountain sword hoard and has started to comprehend it. Zhang Sun Qianxue's face immediately turned cold. Her thoughts were simple and direct. For her, the Yuanwu Emperor was an enemy, and so was Bai Shanshui. The lonely mountain sword hoard was likely to help her catch up to the Yuanwu Emperor's cultivation, so she had to take it. Will it be soon? She asked in a slightly cold voice. Do not be impatient. Ding Ning glanced at her and said seriously, it is true. Do not be impatient. I am not lying to you. I do not know how many years it will take for those below Realm 8 to comprehend and solve it. After a pause, Ding Ning said, Bai Shanshui wants to use the lonely mountain sword hoard to help him reach Realm 8 quickly. But before Realm 8, it is very difficult to comprehend and solve the treasure trove of the lonely mountain sword hoard. So the order here is not right. Zhang Sun Qianxue thought about the meaning in Ding Ning's words and watched as Ding Ning picked up the last wooden sign. This wooden sign looked like it was made from red sandalwood. The color was so purple it was almost black, and there were many golden star-shaped spots on the surface. But the difference was that these golden star-shaped spots were especially bright, and there was some silver light in the gold. It looked like there was another small world inside. There were no characters on the wooden sign, just 3 human-shaped seal scripts. I know what this is. This time, she did not ask and said to Ding Ning, who was studying carefully, I have seen it before. Ding Ning stilled. He had never seen something like this before. He could not help but ask, what is this? Zhang Sun Qianxue said, this is a token of Celestial Seal Sect. Ding Ning's gaze jumped. Zhang Sun Qianxue glanced at him and said, my family once had contact with Celestial Seal Sect. But I had not expected the change to happen so quickly, and was destroyed before I could use the power of Celestial Seal Sect. Other people might not understand the meaning in Zhang Sun Qianxue's words, but Ding Ning knew. Just like how Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingxiu Sword Gate were the strongest sects of the Qin dynasty, Celestial Seal Sect was the strongest sect of the Yan dynasty. In reality, Celestial Seal Sect was like the Bazin Kendo ground of the former Qin dynasty. Its foundation was deeper than Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingxiu Sword Gate. On the surface, the Yan dynasty was at peace with the Qin dynasty, but Ding Ning knew that the Yen had worked hard to stop the rise of the Qin dynasty in these years. So the old Chongling families of the past had been in contact with the Yen dynasty, but they had not acted as quickly as the Yuanwu emperor. In other words, Cloudwater Palace and the Yen dynasty are in an alliance. Ding Ning took a deep breath and calmed himself down. Then he asked, "Then what is the meaning of this token of Celestial Seal sect? Or rather, what is its use?" Zhang Sun Qianxue said, "You can use this to find the contact of Celestial Seal sect. If you channel vital energy into the seal, the contact of Celestial Seal sect will be able to sense your location through unique energies. This kind of immortal wood seal is made from a rare kind of wood. Only the direct disciples of Celestial Seal sect are qualified to possess it. But this kind of immortal wood seal is divided into yin and yang. This is a yin seal. If you channel vital energy into it, other people can sense your location, but you cannot sense their location. As long as it is energy sensing, even if it is divided into yin and yang, there will be a unique connection." Ding Ning looked at the wooden seal in his hand and said softly, "If I can comprehend it, maybe I can change it. I know you have received his inheritance. You are not an ordinary cultivator. You can do something like this." Zhang Sun Qianxue looked at him and said coldly, "But you have enough trouble now. Do you still have the energy to pay attention to the people of Celestial Seal sect?" Ding Ning looked at her and shook his head. He said, "I am just doing some things while waiting. If I find I cannot do anything and do nothing, it will make me despair." Chapter 151. Waiting was the most torturous thing. Yet many times, even those who were high up in the eyes of many people, so high that they seemed to have left the mortal world, were still minuscule in the face of unknown fate. No matter how high they stood, there was still the sky above their heads that they had to look up at. In front of many things, they could only wait. As the snow melted, Chongling went from the cold to the beginning of spring. In the Zhou family ink garden, some of the winter jasmine buds had turned yellow, but there were still many pieces of ice floating in the pond covered in withered lotus leaves. A young woman dressed in eggplant-colored brocade robes walked into this small courtyard under the guidance of Zhou Xie. This young woman was called Zhou Susong and was a branch member of the Zhou family. Her family was in Kuaiji Commandery. Because of her cultivation talent, she had started cultivating in the Nine-Thought Sword sect of Kuaiji Commandery many years ago. This was the first time she had come to Chongling, much less the Zhou family ink garden. Also, when she heard that Forefather Zhou had summoned her, this young woman was extremely nervous. Countless bad guesses spun in her mind, and her palms sweated. Forefather Zhou was sitting on a soft couch covered in brocade that was smoother than the young woman's skin. His silver hair was still combed, so it could reflect his appearance. His coat covered his abdomen. Before the young woman walked into the hall he was in, his gaze had been filled with many negative emotions. Hatred, unwillingness, greed, viciousness. But when Zhou Xie's greeting sounded and the young woman walked in, these emotions disappeared. His expression became extremely amiable again. "Do not be nervous. I summoned you here because there is a secret art in the painting remnant scroll. But this secret art is only suitable for women to cultivate." Looking at the young woman who was extremely nervous and had many goosebumps on her skin, he said slowly and gently, "You should be the most suitable person in the Zhou family to cultivate this secret art right now. You can cultivate in peace in the ink garden." Hearing these words, the young woman was first puzzled, and then cried tears of joy as she knelt in front of him.
Rise.
"My Zhou family is no longer glorious, and I do not know when I will die. In the future, the burden of the Zhou family will fall on you young people." Forefather Zhou still felt it was not enough, and said in an even softer tone. The young girl felt even more emotional. While she was sobbing, she didn't expect that the kind-looking old man's mind wasn't on her. Was this really a method that only women could cultivate? Was the yin qi that was too oppressive could be naturally expelled along with a woman's menstrual cycle? As long as he had 1 or 2 months, he would naturally be able to find out. The old prestigious Zhou family had already declined. Forefather Zhou was like a worm that refused to die, struggling at death's door. The new Marquis Fong family was like the rising sun, shining brightly. In the eastern suburbs of Chongling, in a secluded courtyard in Fenghe Province, Fong Xiumu, his long hair loose like wild grass and his clothes ragged like a beggar, was still sitting in front of the jade pool. The spring water that formed this jade pool was a hot spring that emitted slightly warm steam. There were multiple red carps swimming among the green grasses of the pool. Everyone, including the Fong family cultivators who walked into this secluded courtyard, thought that Fong Xiumu was comprehending sword essence by watching the fish. Yet no one expected that Fong Xiumu was watching life, old age, sickness, and death. The red carps were always taken care of by the female attendants in the courtyard, but there were not the few of them from a decade ago. Even though the spring water was clear, there were still countless unknown reasons that caused the fish to weaken and die. Other than these fish, he also saw many more minute details. He saw some tiny insects in the jade pool. The lifespan of an insect was even shorter than that of an insect's. For example, some mosquitoes in the summer only had a dozen days of life in their cycle. This kind of cycle naturally contained true meaning and the principles of energy creation and destruction. The cultivators of Chongling did not know Fong Xiumu's true cultivation. Based on some clues, they judged that he was Realm 6 first class, and not Realm 7. At this time, only those of high status who were close to the monarch could infer from the emperor's decree that his cultivation was likely above Yi Xiling and the others, and beyond Realm 7 second class. But the reality was that his cultivation was still Realm 6 first class. What was even more shocking was that 10 years ago, he had already glimpsed the path to breaking through to the next realm. In other words, starting from 10 years ago, if he was willing, he could enter Realm 7 at any time. But he had deliberately stayed in front of the gates to Realm 7 for 10 years. How different would he be from the other Realm 7 cultivators after a breakthrough after 10 years of waiting and accumulation? Only he seemed to know this originally. But at this time, he received an imperial decree. The Yuanwu Emperor requested that he attend the Deer Mountain Conference with him. This meant that the Yuanwu Emperor also knew. Su Xiumu did not know why the Yuanwu Emperor also knew, but this broke his mental state. This decree was a request, but it was an order. The imperial decree wanted him to have a breakthrough. He wanted him to sharpen this sword that had been tempered for many years and create a new sky for the Qin dynasty. Other than this, maybe there was a deeper meaning in this imperial decree. The imperial decree could not be disobeyed. Only a breakthrough. Just a little bit more spring. Su Xiumu hesitated for many days. He understood the deeper meaning. He knew he could not wait any longer. At the beginning of spring, he sighed softly and pushed open the door. The presence of spring bloomed from his body. Countless flowers bloomed in the courtyard. Even the cold-fearing peonies bloomed to the brightest. In the morning, Ding Ning, who was holding a bowl of noodles and eating noodles with Shui Wangshu, Zhang Yi, and Shen Yi, was also waiting. But nothing seemed to have happened. Fan Zhua, who had died in the temporary village of the duck farmers, disappeared like an insignificant gangster in Chongling. No one from the Astrology Bureau or the Divinity Bureau appeared around Falling Parasol. It seemed that no one in Chongling even realized the death of this great rebel of Cloud Water Palace. Not waiting for anything to happen was good news for Ding Ning. His vital energy cultivation was growing steadily each day. The beginning of spring was here, and he was one step closer to the Min Mountain Sword trials in the middle of summer. However, he needed more time and things to be sure of what the high and mighty female bureau chief was thinking. In the cold spring, Su Qin carefully inspected his clothing. Then he used the cleanest white cloth to wrap around his left hand, so that his left hand would not look disgusting. Then he walked out of the establishment he had lived in for a long time and walked towards the carriage parked on the side of the street. The carriage was of Chongling standard, but the streets were the streets of Qing City, the capital of the Chu dynasty. The Chu king liked beautiful waists. Looking out, the countless buildings of Chung City were hidden in the greenery like beautiful women. The scenery was exquisite and beautiful. At this time, Su Qin's gaze landed on a begonia by the side of the road. This begonia was in full bloom, its flowers like rouge. Su Qin showed a hint of a smile. He had waited for a long time in this beautiful Chu capital that was completely different from Chongling. Today, he finally received an audience with the most powerful woman of the Chu dynasty. The carriage carried him through the streets and alleys of the Chu capital. Countless branches of the weeping willows gently swayed on the carriage. Many vigilant and emotional gazes watched as this carriage drove into a temporary residence. There was a beautiful bead curtain hanging in the main hall of this palace. Behind the curtain, one could faintly see the legendary woman. As a Qin person, you have come to the Chu to lobby. You have 15 minutes. If you cannot persuade me in this time, it means you and Li Lingjun are failures. I will kill you, and he will not qualify to return here. The woman's voice was soft, but at the same time, there were sharpness stabbing into Su Qin's ears, causing great pain in his eardrums. But his expression was still calm. He bowed his head and said, I do not need 15 minutes. I only need to say one thing. Behind the bead curtain, there was silence, waiting for him to speak. Su Qin said, if you allow him to return here, you are the Empress. You know, the Empress has two meanings. You can have both. Impudence. A shout sounded behind the bead curtain. Because it was too cold and intense, the voice echoed in the hall like countless people were angrily scolding Su Qin for being impudent. The Empress had two meanings. One was Mother Empress, the other was Empress. She could have both. She could have both identities at the same time. But to have both identities at the same time, how rebellious was this? The woman behind the bead curtain naturally knew what Su Qin's words meant, so she scolded him so fiercely. But Su Qin's expression did not change. He bowed deeply and said calmly, but this is the greatest promise Li Lingjun can give. You should also know that if you let him ascend the throne and he gives you both identities, your status here will be even more stable and your relationship with him will be even more stable. The woman behind the bead curtain looked at him, but did not speak. Su Qin looked at the ground. He knew that he had not died yet and would not die today. So he said softly with emotion and satisfaction, you know very well that some people have a lot of time to wait, but some people, some matters cannot wait. Those who hear such impudent words deserve to die. The woman behind the bead curtain finally spoke. A sweet yet extremely terrifying killing intent burst out in the hall. The bead curtain shattered. Blood splattered all over the ground in the hall. The palace attendants on the two sides immediately died. Thousands of beads of various sizes fell on Su Qin's body and the ground around him, bouncing and giving off pleasing sounds.
Su Qin did not die.
He bent even lower and said in a blessing, you will be the most noble mistress of the Chu dynasty now and in the future. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.